Hey everyone, welcome back to Mimi Horror Stories. Tonight, we're bringing you another episode of spine-tingling horror tales set against the calming sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. So, get comfortable, hit that like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. It was the Great Depression, and the trains became a lifeline for many desperate souls seeking work, food, or a mere semblance of hope. I was one of those hobos, riding the rails in search of a better tomorrow. But what I found was far more sinister. Kingsbury Run was a notorious spot, a grimy, industrial stretch in Cleveland where the tracks converged. It was a haven for the down and out, a place where you could blend into the shadows and disappear. But it was also the hunting ground for a monster. I first heard the rumors from other hobos. They spoke in hushed tones about a killer who preyed on men like us, dismembering his victims and leaving their bodies scattered like gruesome jigsaw pieces. They called him the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. I dismissed the stories as fear-mongering until the night I encountered him. It was a cold, moonless night when I arrived at Kingsbury Run. The air was thick with the stench of industry and decay. I found a spot near an old, rusted railcar to hunker down for the night. As I settled in, I heard a noise, a soft, almost rhythmic chopping sound. My curiosity got the better of me, and I crept closer to investigate. What I saw chilled me to the bone. There, in the dim light of a flickering lantern, a figure was hunched over something on the ground. The unmistakable scent of blood filled the air. I watched in horror as the figure methodically hacked at a lifeless body, dismembering it with a terrifying precision. My stomach churned, and I fought the urge to retch. I must have made a sound, for the figure suddenly stopped and looked up. Our eyes met, and I saw nothing but cold, calculating madness in his gaze. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing near another group of hobos who had made a fire for warmth. I told them what I had seen, my voice trembling. Their faces reflected my fear, and we all knew we had to get out of Kingsbury Run. The next morning, we boarded the first train out, leaving behind the grim specter of the Mad Butcher. Dozen men remain nameless, their lives reduced to grisly headlines and cold case files. The memory of that night still haunts me, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. Even now, whenever I hear the distant wail of a train whistle, I think of Kingsbury Run and the monster who prowled its shadows. The Great Depression took many things from us: our jobs, our homes, our dignity. But for some, it also took their lives, stolen by a madman who remains a ghost in the annals of history. It was a sweltering day in the summer of 2004 when the news broke. A college student had been found murdered near the abandoned train tracks in New York City. I remember it vividly because it shook our community to its core. She was a bright and talented student, full of life and promise. We often saw her jogging in the park or heading to classes, always with a smile on her face. That day, she went out for her usual run, but never returned. The search began almost immediately. Friends, family, and even strangers combed the city, hoping to find her safe and sound. Days passed with no sign of her, and our hope began to wane. Then, one morning, a jogger discovered her lifeless body near the old, rusted train tracks, hidden beneath a canopy of overgrown weeds and debris. The scene was horrific. She had been strangled, and her body showed signs of a brutal struggle. The police cordoned off the area, turning the once peaceful park into a somber crime scene. Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, a stark contrast to the vibrant green of the surrounding trees. As the investigation unfolded, the details only added to the horror. She had been attacked and overpowered, her final moments filled with terror. The police canvassed the area, interviewed countless people, and followed up on numerous leads, but the killer remained elusive. Rumors and theories spread like wildfire. Some believed it was a random attack by a transient or someone familiar with the area. Others thought it might have been a planned assault by someone she knew. The uncertainty and fear gripped us all. In the weeks that followed, memorials and vigils were held in her honor. The community came together to mourn and to demand justice. Her family was devastated, their grief palpable as they pleaded for any information that might lead to the arrest of the person responsible. Despite the efforts of law enforcement, the case went cold. There were no witnesses, no concrete evidence, and no suspect to bring to justice. The killer had vanished, leaving behind only pain and unanswered questions. Years have passed since that tragic day, but the memory of her life and the brutal way it was taken from her still lingers. Every time I pass by those old train tracks, I am reminded of the senseless violence and the bright future that was stolen from her. The investigation remains open, and her family continues to hope for closure. They deserve answers, and she deserves justice. Until that day comes, we hold on to the memories of her kindness, her joy, and the light she brought into our lives, and we remain vigilant, hoping that one day, the truth will finally come to light. It was the summer of 1946, and the small town of Texarkana was buzzing with its usual southern charm and quiet routine. But the calm was shattered when a series of brutal attacks began, casting a dark shadow over the community. I remember that summer vividly. The town was gripped by fear as the so-called Phantom Killer struck with chilling precision. It all started one night when a young couple parked at a secluded spot near the edge of town. The Phantom Killer approached their car and, without warning, attacked them. The violence was sudden and merciless. The girl survived but was left severely injured, while the boy was tragically killed. The news of the attack spread quickly, and the town was thrown into a state of panic. People began locking their doors and avoiding the quiet, secluded areas that once felt safe. Then, just a few weeks later, the killer struck again, this time targeting another couple. They too were attacked while parked in a remote area. The details of the crime were horrific, with the victim suffering from the same brutal treatment as the first pair. As the summer wore on, the attacks continued. The Phantom Killer seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost, always eluding capture. Each attack followed a similar pattern: young couples, isolated locations, and an overwhelming sense of terror. The police were stumped, with no leads and no clear motive. The entire town was on edge. Rumors swirled about the killer's identity, and every shadow seemed to hold a hint of danger. Local authorities, alongside state and federal investigators, worked tirelessly, but the killer remained elusive. Witnesses reported seeing a masked figure, but their descriptions were vague and conflicting. Despite the intense investigation and widespread media coverage, the Phantom Killer was never caught. As quickly as the attacks had begun, they stopped, leaving the town with more questions than answers. The fear and anxiety slowly faded, but the memory of those brutal nights lingered. To this day, the identity of the Phantom Killer remains unknown. The case has become a chilling reminder of the fragility of safety and the shadows that can lurk even in the most seemingly tranquil places. The people of Texarkana still remember those dark days, a somber testament to the terror that once gripped their community. It was a warm summer evening in 2003 when I last saw them. The couple, full of life and excitement, were headed to Australia for what was supposed to be a memorable adventure. They were traveling by train, something they always enjoyed. But what began as a joyous trip turned into an unsettling mystery. I remember the night they disappeared. The train was running smoothly, making its way through the scenic Australian countryside. It was supposed to be a relaxing journey, but as the hours passed, something felt off. The couple seemed to vanish without a trace, leaving no indication of their departure. Initially, everyone thought it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe they had gotten off at an earlier stop or missed their connection. But as the train rolled on and they didn't reappear, worry began to set in. The crew and fellow passengers were baffled. The train had been checked thoroughly. Their belongings were still in their compartments, but there was no sign of them. The authorities were alerted, and a massive search was launched. Police combed through the train routes, interviewed witnesses, and checked nearby stations, but there were no clues. It was as if the couple had simply evaporated into thin air. The only thing that seemed certain was that they had not left the train voluntarily. Rumors began to swirl. Some thought they might have been involved in a criminal act or foul play, while others speculated about a more sinister reason for their disappearance. The more the investigation unfolded, the more mysterious their vanishing became. Months passed, and the case grew colder. The search gradually tapered off, and the couple's disappearance remained unresolved. The authorities were left with only fragmented theories and a troubling sense of unanswered questions. The train they had been on continued its routes, but the mystery of what happened to them cast a long shadow over the railway. To this day, the fate of that couple remains one of Australia's eerie unsolved mysteries. Whenever I hear about strange disappearances or unsettling stories on the news, I can't help but think of that summer evening and the couple who vanished without a trace. It's a stark reminder of how even the most ordinary journeys can end in the most inexplicable ways. It was a crisp autumn day in 1966 when the disaster struck. I was living in Wales, not far from Aberfan, a small mining village nestled in the hills. The coal slurry tip, a massive pile of waste from the local mine, had been a constant presence in our lives. We knew it was dangerous, but no one expected it would cause such devastation. That morning, everything seemed normal. The village was bustling with its usual activity as people went about their daily routines. The children were excited, looking forward to a day at school. But as the day wore on, a series of tremors began to shake the area, and soon the worst happened. Without warning, the slurry tip, saturated with water and instability, gave way. A massive wave of coal waste surged down the hill, engulfing everything in its path. I remember the horror of seeing the sludge pour into the village, swallowing houses, roads, and tragically, the school where so many children were. The aftermath was heart-wrenching. The rescue efforts were frantic, with teams of volunteers and emergency responders digging through the muck to save anyone they could. The train station, which had previously been a place of routine departures and arrivals, became the site of somber coordination and relief efforts. It was there that the true scale of the tragedy began to sink in. Over the next few days, the town was a hive of activity, but the mood was somber. The loss was immense. 144 people, including 116 children, had been killed. The wreckage left behind was a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the hidden dangers that lurked in our everyday surroundings. The horror of Aberfan lingered in my mind long after the immediate aftermath. Even now, whenever I hear the distant rumble of a train or see coal heaps, I am reminded of that day. The tragedy was a dark chapter in our village's history, a reminder of the unexpected and devastating consequences of neglect and oversight. To this day, the memory of Aberfan serves as a somber lesson in the importance of safety and vigilance. The disaster remains a poignant example of how quickly life can be upended, and how the echoes of such tragedies continue to reverberate through the years. It was late at night in 2007 when I boarded the train in Japan, heading home after a long day. The atmosphere was quiet, with most passengers either asleep or lost in their thoughts. But something about that night felt different, as if an invisible presence was watching us. As the train chugged along its route, an unsettling feeling settled over me. I glanced around, noticing a few other passengers looking equally uneasy. The lights flickered intermittently, adding to the eerie ambience. I tried to shake off the feeling and focused on the rhythmic clatter of the wheels. But then, things took a turn for the bizarre. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadowy figure moving through the carriage. It was unlike any passenger I had ever seen. Its form seemed to waver and shift, as though it wasn't quite solid. I tried to convince myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on my mind, but the figure persisted. A few moments later, other passengers began to murmur and point towards the same spot. Someone mentioned they had seen the figure as well. The tension in the carriage was palpable. The train conductor was alerted, and he came through the carriage, looking concerned but unable to spot anything unusual. When we reached the next station, a few passengers decided to leave the train early, shaken by the strange encounter. The station staff were notified, and they assured us they would investigate. As the train continued on its journey, the figure was nowhere to be seen, but the unease remained. The following day, news spread that similar eerie sightings had been reported on other trains in the area. Passengers spoke of ghostly figures and unexplained phenomena, contributing to the legend of the ghost train in Japan. The experiences seemed to converge around the same unsettling figure I had seen, and the stories only added to the mystery. To this day, The memory of that night lingers with me. The sensation of an otherworldly presence on that seemingly ordinary train ride remains vivid. Every time I board a train now, I can't help but feel a twinge of apprehension, wondering if the spectral figure will make another appearance. I've always believed that the quiet, lonely nights on the train held a certain charm. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels, the soft hum of the engine, and the occasional whistle breaking the silence, it all seemed so serene. But that night, everything changed. I was a passenger on the last train of the evening, heading to the end of the line. The carriage was nearly empty, save for a few tired commuters and myself. I settled into my seat, pulled out a book, and tried to lose myself in its pages. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the train sped through the dark countryside, I noticed a figure moving stealthily through the carriages. He seemed to be searching for something or someone. His eyes darted around, and his movements were tense. I tried to ignore him, convincing myself that it was none of my business. But then, a chilling scream pierced the night. The entire carriage froze. My heart pounded as I looked around, trying to locate the source of the scream. It came from a few seats behind me. Slowly, I turned and saw the figure from earlier standing over a lifeless body. Blood pooled around the victim, staining the floor a deep crimson. Panic ensued. Passengers scrambled to move away, some crying, others shouting for help. But we were trapped. The train continued its relentless journey, the end of the line still miles away. The figure made no move to escape. Instead, he stood there, staring at his handiwork with a cold, detached expression. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. Desperation clawed at me as I realized we had to wait until the next station to call for help. The minutes dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. The murderer, sensing our helplessness, calmly walked to the end of the carriage and sat down, as if nothing had happened. When we finally reached the station, the police were waiting. Someone must have alerted them earlier. The murderer was apprehended without resistance. As they led him away, he turned and looked at me, his eyes devoid of emotion. That gaze haunts me to this day. The investigation revealed that the victim and the murderer had a history, a tale of betrayal and revenge that culminated in that horrifying night. But for those of us on that train, it was an experience that shattered the illusion of safety the night train once held. It was a late, moonless night, and I was driving home after a long day at work. The road was empty, with only the occasional flicker of my headlights illuminating the way. I was eager to get home, the quiet hum of my car providing a semblance of comfort. As I drove along the winding country road, something caught my eye. There, on the side of the road, stood a woman dressed in a flowing white dress. She seemed out of place, standing so still in the darkness. My heart skipped a beat. I considered driving past, but something compelled me to stop. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "Are you all right?" I called out. She turned to face me, and I could see her eyes glistening with tears. "I need help," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. I got out of the car and approached her. She looked pale and fragile, as if she might disappear at any moment. "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She pointed down the road, towards a dark, wooded area. "My car broke down. I need to get home," she whispered. I offered her a ride, and she nodded gratefully. We got back into the car, and she directed me to a small, unmarked road leading into the woods. The air grew colder as we drove deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around us. As we drove, I tried to make conversation. "What's your name?" I asked. She remained silent, staring straight ahead. I felt a growing unease, but I pushed it aside. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. "Just here," she said, pointing to a clearing up ahead. I stopped the car, and she turned to me, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Thank you," she whispered. Before stepping out of the car, I watched as she walked towards the edge of the clearing, her white dress glowing faintly in the darkness. I waited for a moment, expecting her to wave or give some indication that she was all right, but she simply vanished into the night. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something didn't feel right. I turned the car around and headed back to the main road, my mind racing. When I reached the safety of the highway, I pulled over to gather my thoughts. I decided to call the local police, just in case she needed more help. The officer who answered listened to my story, and then asked me to meet him at the station. When I arrived, he showed me a photograph. "Is this the woman you saw?" he asked. My blood ran cold as I recognized her face. "Yes, that's her," I replied. The officer sighed and shook his head. "She's been missing for years," he said. "Many people have reported seeing her on that road, but no one knows what happened to her. They say she wanders the woods, looking for help, but when someone stops, she vanishes." I left the station feeling a mix of fear and sadness. To this day, I can't shake the image of her standing by the roadside, her eyes pleading for help. Every time I drive down a lonely road at night, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman in white, forever seeking the way home. I've always enjoyed taking late night drives. There's something about the empty roads and the quiet of the night that I find calming. One night, I decided to take a route I hadn't driven in years, a lonely stretch of road that winds through a dense forest. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the trees. As I drove, I saw something up ahead on the side of the road. It was an old, abandoned car. It seemed out of place, just sitting there with its driver's door ajar. Curious, I pulled over to take a closer look. I got out of my car and approached the abandoned vehicle. The air felt colder as I neared it, and a sense of unease settled over me. The car was covered in a thin layer of dust, as if it had been there for some time, but there was something else: fresh bloodstains on the driver's seat and the steering wheel. My heart began to race. I looked around, half expecting to see someone emerging from the woods, but there was nothing but silence. I debated calling the police, but my phone had no signal. I decided to investigate further, hoping to find some clue about what had happened. I checked the back seat and the trunk, but found nothing. The more I looked, the stronger the feeling of dread grew. It was as if the car itself was trying to tell me something terrible had happened here. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound coming from the trees. I froze, listening intently. The sound grew louder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I hurried back to my car, glancing over my shoulder as I went. The abandoned car seemed to loom larger in the moonlight, a dark presence against the pale road. I got back into my car and locked the doors, my hands shaking. As I started the engine, I saw movement in my rearview mirror. A shadowy figure was standing near the abandoned car, watching me. I couldn't make out any features, but the figure's presence was menacing. I hit the gas and sped away, my mind racing. I drove straight to the nearest town and found a place with cell reception. I called the police and reported what I had seen. They assured me they would investigate and asked for my details. A few days later, I received a call from the police. They had found the car, but there was no sign of the bloodstains or the figure I had seen. They asked if I was sure about what I had witnessed, and I insisted that I was. It was well past midnight, and I was alone on a long stretch of highway. My fuel gauge was dangerously low, and the road ahead was empty. Just as I started to panic, a flickering neon sign appeared through the fog. A gas station. Relieved, I pulled in, but an unsettling chill crept over me. The place looked frozen in time, with peeling paint and flickering lights casting eerie shadows. I parked by a pump and got out, scanning the area. There wasn't a soul in sight, but the lights inside the station were on, so I headed for the door. Inside, the air was stale and heavy. An old man stood behind the counter, his eyes fixed on me as if he'd been expecting someone. "Evening," he said, in a voice that grated like sandpaper. "Need some gas?" I nodded, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at me. As I walked back to my car, I noticed the other pumps were covered in cobwebs, as if they hadn't been used in years. I shook off the feeling and started fueling up. When I returned to pay, the old man leaned forward, his gaze unnerving. "Where you headed?" he asked, voice low. "Just passing through," I replied, feigning confidence. He handed me my change, his fingers cold as ice. "Be careful out there," he warned. "Strange things happen on these roads at night." His words sent a chill racing down my spine. Hurrying back to my car, I started the engine and drove away. Glancing in the rearview mirror, the old man was still there, watching me with those piercing eyes. A few miles down the road, My radio crackled to life with strange static. I fiddled with the dial, but it wouldn't change. The static rose to an unbearable pitch, then abruptly stopped, plunging the car into eerie silence. As I drove on, the fog thickened, and I felt a growing sense of dread. Suddenly, headlights appeared ahead, cutting through the mist. A car approached, its windows dark and inscrutable. As it passed, I glanced over and froze. The driver was the old man from the gas station, his expression blank, eyes locked straight ahead. My heart pounded as I pressed the accelerator, desperate to escape. When I finally reached home, I felt a wave of relief, but the encounter haunted me. Later, I discovered the gas station had been abandoned for years, ever since a string of mysterious disappearances on that highway. It was a late Saturday night, and I was driving home after visiting a friend in a nearby town. The highway was deserted, the only light coming from my headlights cutting through the darkness. I enjoyed the solitude of night drives, the quiet and the sense of calm they brought. But this night would be different. I was about halfway home when I heard a faint sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as I slowed down and rolled down the window, I heard it more clearly. It was the unmistakable sound of a baby crying, echoing through the night. I pulled over to the side of the road, the crying growing louder and more desperate. My heart raced as I stepped out of the car, the cool night air sending a shiver down my spine. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and started towards the source of the sound, which seemed to be coming from the dense woods lining the road. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Is someone there?" The crying continued, a pitiful wail that tugged at my heart. I pushed through the underbrush, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. After a few minutes of searching, I came to a small clearing. The crying seemed to be coming from just beyond it. As I stepped into the clearing, the crying abruptly stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. I swung the flashlight around, trying to see if I could spot anything, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. Feeling a growing sense of unease, I decided to head back to the car. As I turned, my flashlight caught something on the ground, an old, tattered blanket. It looked like it had been there for years, partially buried under fallen leaves. My heart pounded as I picked it up. There was no sign of a baby, no footprints, nothing to indicate anyone had been there recently. I rushed back to my car, my mind racing. I slammed the door shut, locking it for good measure. As I sat there, trying to calm down, I heard the crying again, this time fainter, as if it were moving away from the road. I put the car in gear and sped off, the sound fading into the distance. It was an unusually cold night, and I was driving home on a remote stretch of highway, far from any signs of civilization. The road was straight, but the trees on either side seemed to close in, their shadows stretching across the asphalt like dark, looming fingers. The only light came from my car's headlights, piercing the darkness. The quiet was unsettling. Just as I started to relax into the rhythmic hum of the engine, something strange happened. My car suddenly jolted, and the engine sputtered. The headlights flickered, then dimmed to a ghostly glow. I pressed the accelerator, but the car seemed to be mired in an invisible quagmire. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to maintain control, but the car felt like it was moving through thick sludge. The brakes were barely responding, and I could see the trees coming closer and closer. My pulse quickened, and panic set in. I tried to pull over, but the car wouldn't cooperate. It felt as though an unseen force was holding it back. I finally managed to bring the car to a stop on the side of the road, the engine still sputtering. I stepped out, my breath visible in the cold air. The silence was deafening. The road seemed normal, no ice, no debris. My car, however, seemed to be enveloped in an eerie stillness. As I tried to figure out what was wrong, I noticed something strange. The air around the car felt unnaturally cold, almost icy. A shiver ran down my spine as I heard a low, distant hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The sound grew louder, a relentless drone that seemed to seep into my bones. I got back into the car, desperate to leave. When I restarted the engine, it roared to life as if nothing had happened. The headlights were bright again, and the car felt perfectly normal. Relieved, I drove off. But my nerves were on edge. The road ahead seemed to stretch into an abyss. Every shadow seemed to move, and I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. The hum from earlier faded, but the oppressive silence that replaced it was equally unsettling. When I finally reached home, I was shaken. I couldn't get the incident out of my mind, so I decided to investigate. The next day, I returned to the spot in broad daylight. The road was clear, the trees were just trees, and there was no sign of anything unusual. But the locals I spoke to had their own stories. They spoke of a stretch of road where cars inexplicably lose power and control. Some believed it was due to a magnetic anomaly. Others whispered of a tragic accident from years ago, a driver who had died under mysterious circumstances. It was one of those nights where the road seemed to stretch on endlessly. I had been driving for hours, trying to get home after a long day. The night was quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. I was halfway through my journey when I began to feel an inexplicable chill. My car's interior was perfectly warm, but the feeling of cold was unsettling. I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, but everything seemed normal, just the empty back seat behind me. As I continued driving, the chill intensified. It was as if the temperature in the car was dropping rapidly. I adjusted the heater, but it didn't make a difference. The cold persisted, and I began to feel increasingly uneasy. Every now and then, I would glance over my shoulder into the back seat, half expecting to see something, but it was always empty. Then, I felt a cold, heavy presence in the back of the car. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the usual back seat with the shadowy outlines of the car's interior. I tried to brush it off as exhaustion, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The sensation grew more intense, and I could almost feel a cold breath on the back of my neck. It was as if someone or something was right behind me, just out of sight. I pulled over to the side of the road, turned on the interior light, and checked the back seat thoroughly. There was nothing there, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. Feeling slightly reassured, but still on edge, I got back into the car and continued my drive. The oppressive cold seemed to follow me, and every little noise made me jump. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands tightly gripping the steering wheel, my anxiety growing with every mile. When I finally reached home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in the back seat with me. I checked the car thoroughly again, but everything was as it should be. I spent the rest of the night restless, replaying every moment in my head. It was well past midnight, and I had been driving for hours on an isolated highway, feeling the fatigue of the journey. My stomach was growling, and I was desperate for a break. As I rounded a bend, a dim, flickering neon sign caught my eye, a diner, of all things, in the middle of nowhere. Relieved, I pulled into the parking lot, hoping for a quick bite. The moment I walked through the door, an uneasy feeling settled over me. The diner was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every small noise seem amplified. The neon lights outside barely illuminated the dusty interior, casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls. I was greeted by a bell's soft jingle and an elderly woman behind the counter. Her smile was tired and vacant, her eyes distant as she handed me a menu. I noticed her hands were shaking slightly as she set it down. I took a seat at the counter, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. The diner's booths were occupied, but by figures shrouded in shadows, their faces hidden from view. I could feel their eyes on me, though none of them moved or spoke. The stillness was unnerving. When I ordered, the elderly woman disappeared into the back, leaving me alone with the unsettling ambience. The patrons continued to watch me, their gazes unblinking and cold. The silence grew heavier, and the dim lights seemed to flicker more frequently. Moments later, the woman returned with my food, her movements robotic. As she placed the plate in front of me, her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to eat, but the food tasted bland and unappetizing. Every bite felt like a chore as the oppressive atmosphere weighed on me. Without warning, the power went out. The entire diner plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the neon sign outside. casting eerie shadows through the window. The silence was now punctuated by an occasional creak and the soft hum of something just out of sight. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight, but the moment I switched it on, the diner's lights flickered back to life. The elderly woman and the patrons remained exactly as they were, their expressions unchanged, their stares more intense than before. My unease escalated. I finished my meal quickly, paid at the counter, and made a beeline for the door. As I turned to leave, I glanced back at the diner. The woman and the patrons were still watching me, their eyes following my every move. Their faces seemed even more distorted in the flickering light. Once outside, I hurried to my car and started driving, my heart racing. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me as I drove away. I couldn't shake the image of those vacant eyes staring through the window. The next day, I researched the diner and found out it had been closed for years. There were rumors that on some nights, it would appear as if it were still operational. Locals spoke of strange occurrences and ghostly figures in the diner, trapped in a timeless loop. I've always been drawn to the coast, with its salty air and the rhythmic crashing of waves against the shore. So, when I heard about the old lighthouse a few miles up the beach, I couldn't resist the urge to explore. The locals whispered about it with a mix of reverence and fear, calling it haunted, but I was skeptical. Ghost stories were just that, stories. One late afternoon, I decided to visit the lighthouse. The sky was overcast, casting a gray hue over the landscape. As I walked along the rocky path leading to the tower, the wind picked up, howling through the gaps in the rocks. The lighthouse loomed ahead, its once bright paint now faded and peeling, the windows dark and empty. I pushed open the creaky wooden door and stepped inside. The air was damp and musty, filled with the scent of age and decay. The interior was surprisingly intact, with old furniture and equipment scattered around, as if the keeper had just stepped out for a moment. I began to explore, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I climbed the spiral staircase, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Each step seemed to reverberate louder than the last, the echoes bouncing off the stone walls. When I reached the top, I found the lantern room, its glass panes offering a panoramic view of the turbulent sea below. I stood there for a while, lost in thought, when suddenly heard a faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But the sound grew more distinct. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps climbing the stairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to face the door. The footsteps stopped just outside the room, and I held my breath, waiting for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. Standing there was a figure, dressed in old-fashioned lighthouse keeper's attire. His face was shrouded in shadow, but his eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness, staring right at me. I was frozen in place, unable to move or speak. The figure didn't say a word, he just stood there, watching me. After what felt like hours but was probably only moments, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the stairs. The spell broke, and I rushed to the door, peering down the staircase, but there was no one there. The footsteps had vanished. I left the lighthouse in a hurry, my skepticism shattered. The locals were right, the place was haunted. The keeper, it seemed, was still tending to his duty, unaware that his watch had ended long ago. To this day, I can't forget those piercing eyes and the feeling of being watched. The lighthouse stands as a silent sentinel, its ghostly keeper still watching over the treacherous waters, forever bound to his post. We decided to have a beach bonfire one summer night, eager to enjoy the stars and the sound of the waves. The air was warm, and the sky was clear, perfect for an evening on the sand. We gathered our friends and set up near a quiet stretch of beach, away from the crowds. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, we lit the fire. The flames danced and crackled, casting flickering shadows that played along the shoreline. As we settled in, telling stories and roasting marshmallows, an unsettling feeling crept over me. It was subtle at first, a cool breeze that seemed to come from nowhere, whispering through the tall grasses. I brushed it off as nothing more than the ocean's chill. Then, without warning, the fire flared up, its flames growing impossibly high. We all jumped back, startled, but just as quickly as it had risen, the fire settled back down, returning to its normal size. We exchanged nervous glances, trying to laugh it off. That's when I noticed them figures dancing around the fire. They seemed to flicker in and out of existence, their forms transparent and ethereal. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I stared, it became clear that these weren't mere shadows. The figures moved in a rhythm, swaying and spinning to a melody only they could hear. Their faces were indistinct, but there was something familiar about their movements, as if they were reenacting a celebration from long ago. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized we were witnessing something otherworldly. The figures seemed unaware of our presence, lost in their spectral dance. My friends saw them too, their expressions shifting from confusion to fear. We watched, mesmerized and terrified, until one of the figures turned towards us. Though its face was blurred, I felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow emanating from it. It raised an arm as if beckoning us to join in, and a sudden gust of wind extinguished the fire completely. In the darkness, we scrambled to gather our things, our hearts pounding with fear. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of the car, the beach, a distant memory behind us. Later, we learned about a tragic accident that had occurred on that very spot many years ago. A group celebrating with a bonfire had been swept away by a rogue wave, their joyful evening turning to disaster. It seemed that their spirits lingered, forever, reliving their final moments. To this day, I can't shake the memory of that night, the spectral dancers, and the chilling invitation to join them. I haven't been back to that beach since, but the experience left a lasting impression, a reminder of the mysteries that linger just beyond our understanding. I always loved evening walks along the beach. There's something soothing about the sound of waves and the feel of sand underfoot. But one night, everything changed. It was a calm evening, the sun dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in deep purples and reds. I wandered further than usual, lost in thought, when I noticed something strange. A shadow that didn't belong, a dark figure standing atop the dunes. At first, I thought it was just another person enjoying the view, but as I got closer, a chill ran down my spine. The figure didn't move, didn't shift at all, even as the wind picked up, tugging at my clothes and whispering through the grass. I called out, but there was no response, just the relentless crash of waves and the growing sense that something was very wrong. I took a step closer, and the figure seemed to blur, fading into the twilight, yet remaining perfectly still. My heart pounded as I approached. Suddenly, the shadow shifted, sliding across the sand without a sound. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, intent on leading me somewhere. Against my better judgment, I followed. The shadow moved towards a cluster of rocks, where the beach met the wild, untamed brush. As I neared, I stumbled upon a weathered old path, half hidden and overgrown. The shadow lingered at the entrance before disappearing completely, leaving me alone with the sound of the wind and my own racing thoughts. I hesitated, then stepped onto the path, curiosity outweighing my fear. The trail twisted through dense foliage, and as I walked, a sense of unease settled over me. It felt as if I was trespassing on forgotten ground. Eventually, I emerged onto a small, secluded cove. The air was heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't quite understand. I turned back, expecting to see the shadow again, but there was nothing, just the empty beach and the distant sound of the surf. Shaken, I made my way back home, trying to rationalize what I'd experienced, but deep down, I knew I had encountered something beyond explanation. Later, I discovered that a traveler had gone missing in the area long ago, never found, despite countless searches. It was one of those rare, sunny winter days in Modesto, California, when the neighborhood was lit up with the kind of bright, clear light that makes everything look fresh and hopeful. She was a familiar face around town, known for her radiant smile and the way she seemed to brighten any room she entered. The day she disappeared started like any other. She had made plans for the day, simple things, grocery shopping, picking up some items for the home. But as hours passed and she didn't return, concern started to build among her family and friends. Her husband was the one to report her missing, noting that she had vanished without a trace. At first, it was treated as a missing person case. Everyone hoped for a quick resolution, believing she would walk through the door any minute. But as days turned into weeks, hope began to wane. The community rallied to search for her, and the media picked up the story, amplifying the sense of urgency and concern. Then, the investigation took a disturbing turn. The husband's behavior began to raise suspicions. He was inconsistent with his story and seemed unusually detached. When investigators questioned him, they found that his alibi didn't hold up under scrutiny. The turning point came when a body was discovered in the San Francisco Bay. The remains were identified as her, and the discovery was a devastating blow to everyone who had hoped for a different outcome. The case, once focused on finding her, shifted to uncovering the truth behind her death. The investigation revealed a chilling motive. It turned out that the husband had been leading a double life and had been involved in an affair. The evidence pointed to a premeditated act. He had planned to dispose of her body in a way that would make it look like an accident, a tragic mishap at sea. During the trial, the details that emerged were heart-wrenching. The way he had manipulated the situation, the lies he told, and the coldness with which he carried out his plan shocked everyone. It was as though he had taken away not just her life, but the very essence of what it meant to trust someone. The trial concluded with a conviction. He was sentenced to death, a fitting punishment for the crime. Though it offered little solace to those who had lost someone so dear, the community was left grappling with the aftermath, trying to make sense of a senseless act. Her memory became a beacon for change, a reminder of the impact one person's life can have on others. Each year, her family and friends gather to remember her, honoring her with memorials and acts of kindness that reflect the joy and love she had brought into their lives. It was a chilly December day when the first set of remains was discovered along the desolate stretch of Gilgo Beach on Long Island. The discovery came by accident. A routine search by a police officer looking for a missing person led to the unearthing of human remains hidden in the dense underbrush. What was initially a somber task quickly turned into something far more sinister. At first, we were hopeful it was an isolated incident, a single tragic case. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this beach held many dark secrets. Over the next few weeks, more remains were found, each discovery revealing more about the grim reality we were facing. The remains belonged to several young women, all of whom had been reported missing over the past few years. The details were horrifying. Each victim had been strangled, their bodies discarded like trash along the remote coastline. The sheer brutality of the killings was overwhelming, and the pattern that emerged was chilling. As the investigation deepened, it became apparent that the killer had a specific method. The remains were carefully placed, hidden but accessible, suggesting a certain level of planning and familiarity with the area. The beach, with its secluded spots and hidden alcoves, became a haunting symbol of the killer's ability to operate in the shadows. The case attracted national attention, media coverage intensified, and the beach became a grim focal point of the investigation. Search teams combed the area, scouring every inch of the coastline in hopes of finding additional clues or leads. The community was on edge, with everyone wondering who could be responsible for such horrors. As the investigation progressed, the focus turned to suspects with connections to the victims or the area. The police interviewed numerous people, trying to piece together a profile of the killer. Each interview, each lead, felt like a step toward uncovering the truth, but the case remained frustratingly elusive. Years passed, and the case grew colder. The media coverage eventually faded, leaving the families and the community with an unsettling sense of unfinished business. The beach, once a place of natural beauty, became a haunting reminder of the lives lost and the mystery that remained. Despite the passage of time, the case was never fully resolved. The beach remained a somber monument to the victims and the chilling reality of the crimes that occurred there. The families of the victims continued to seek answers, hoping that one day, justice would be served. Every year, on the anniversary of the first discovery, the community gathers for a memorial. They come to remember the victims, to honor their lives, and to reaffirm their commitment to finding the truth. The beach, now forever marked by tragedy, serves as a constant reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most unsuspecting places. I remember the summer we spent at the old beach cottage. It was supposed to be a getaway, a break from the chaos of life. Little did we know that the haunting legend of the siren would turn our vacation into a nightmare. From the moment we arrived, there was something unsettling about the place. The locals whispered about the siren song, a melody so captivating it could lure anyone to their doom. We laughed it off, attributing it to superstition. But on our first night, as we gathered around a bonfire, we heard it, a soft, haunting melody carried by the wind. It was beautiful and terrifying, sending shivers down our spines. Despite the eerie start, we tried to enjoy our days at the beach. Yet, the feeling of being watched never left me. It was as if the ocean itself held secrets, waiting to be uncovered. One evening, unable to resist the pull of the song, I found myself wandering alone along the shore. The sun had set, casting long shadows on the sand. As the waves crashed against the rocks, the melody grew louder, wrapping around me like a siren's embrace. I was drawn toward the jagged cliffs, each step bringing me closer to the source of the song. Just as I was about to step into the surf, a cold wave splashed against my feet, jolting me back to reality. I stumbled back, terrified by how close I had come to losing myself. The next day, desperate for answers, I visited the local library. The librarian spoke of a tragic past of sailors lured by a siren, disappearing beneath the waves. It was said that the siren was once a woman, her spirit trapped in an endless cycle of sorrow. Determined to protect my friends, I shared what I had learned. Together, we decided to confront the legend and put an end to the haunting melody. That night, armed with nothing but flashlights and courage, we ventured to the cliffs. The song was stronger than ever, echoing through the night. As we neared the edge, a figure emerged from the sea, a woman with eyes as deep as the ocean, singing a mournful tune. As we reached the edge of the cliffs, the song intensified, pulling us closer. Suddenly, a ghostly figure emerged from the sea, a woman with eyes like dark voids, her hair flowing wildly around her. We froze, terror gripping us as her mournful song pierced the night. Her presence was both mesmerizing and horrifying, an ethereal vision that sent chills down our spines. Panic set in, and we stumbled backward, hearts racing. The fear was overwhelming, and instinct took over. We turned and fled, scrambling over the rocks, desperate to escape the apparition that haunted the cliffs. It began with an ominous feeling that crept through the night like a cold whisper. The air was still, the streets bathed in the dim glow of streetlights, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. It was a deceptively calm evening, the kind where everything looks peaceful but feels slightly off. She had stayed late at the office, finishing up what she thought would be a quick task. As the clock ticked past the hour, the office grew quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound in the empty room. She packed her things, said her goodbyes, and left, stepping into the darkened streets. It was the last time anyone would see her. By midnight, her family's concern was palpable. Her phone calls went unanswered, and her texts received no reply. She was always prompt and reliable, a fact that made her absence all the more unsettling. The gnawing worry grew into panic as the hours dragged on. The next morning, the search began in earnest. Local authorities and volunteers scoured the town, handing out flyers and questioning anyone who might have seen her. As the days passed, hope dwindled. Her case was rapidly becoming one of those haunting missing persons stories that rarely end well. Then, the breakthrough arrived, but it was anything but comforting. A group of hikers ventured into the overgrown, desolate areas near the Mississippi River, seeking solace in nature's calm. Instead, they found something far more sinister. Beneath the camouflage of fallen leaves and twisted branches, they discovered her lifeless body, hidden away in a secluded part of the forest. The scene was horrifying. The forest, once serene, now felt like a crypt. Her body had been abandoned in a way that spoke of premeditated malice. Her clothes were torn, and the signs of a violent struggle were evident. The brutality of the crime was staggering, each detail more chilling than the last. The police launched a meticulous investigation, delving into the dark underbelly of the community. They found evidence suggesting the killer had been stalking her, waiting for the right moment to strike. Surveillance footage showed her entering a cab that never reached its destination, leading to a web of suspicion and fear. The search for the killer took a grim turn as they identified a suspect, a man who had been known to frequent the area where her body was found. His connection to the crime scene was disturbing. The police uncovered a trail of evidence that pointed to his chilling familiarity with the secluded location. It was as if he had chosen the spot with a cold, calculated precision. The trial was a public spectacle, with every disturbing detail of the crime laid bare. The courtroom was charged with tension, each revelation more grotesque than the last. The suspect's demeanor, cold and unrepentant, only added to the horror. It became clear that he had meticulously planned and executed his crime, using his knowledge of the area to evade capture and leave behind a haunting scene. In the end, the jury found him guilty, sentencing him to life in prison. But the community was left with a profound sense of unease. The serene riverbank and the quiet office where she had worked were forever tainted by the violence that had occurred. The memory of her tragic end remained a shadow over the town, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk just beneath the surface of everyday life. The ice truck killer. My sister vanished one cold winter night, and our world shattered. She was vibrant and full of life, and her disappearance left us clinging to hope, but fearing the worst. Months dragged on without a trace. The police worked tirelessly, but it felt like we were chasing shadows. Then, one day, they called with news that changed everything. My sister's body had been found frozen, preserved, inside a refrigerated truck. The discovery was horrifying. The truck driver responsible had been using his vehicle to transport and preserve the bodies of his victims. He exploited the cold to delay decomposition, complicating the investigation and giving himself more time to evade capture. This man had been operating for years, targeting vulnerable women at truck stops and rest areas. He was a predator, using his seemingly ordinary job as a cover for his monstrous crimes. My sister was not his only victim. She was one of many, caught in his web of deceit and brutality. Learning the details was unbearable. My sister had been lured by his charm and apparent kindness, only to be met with unspeakable horror. The killer's method was cold and calculated. He would offer help or a ride, gaining his victims' trust before turning on them. He then used his refrigerated truck to transport their bodies across state lines, making it difficult for law enforcement to connect the dots. The day they arrested him was a bittersweet victory. Seeing him in handcuffs, facing justice, brought some relief, but it couldn't bring my sister back. The trial was a grueling process, filled with gruesome details that haunted me. The testimonies of other victims' families were heart-wrenching. We were united in our grief and anger, seeking justice for those we had lost. The killer showed no remorse, but the evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life without parole. It was a small comfort to know he would never hurt anyone again, but the pain of losing my sister remained. I was on a long-haul journey, driving through the night on an endless stretch of highway. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires created a hypnotic rhythm, lulling me into a trance-like state. Hours passed in a blur, and suddenly, I snapped back to reality. Jolted by the blaring horn of an oncoming truck, I swerved just in time, narrowly avoiding a collision. My heart pounded as I realized I had no memory of the last few hours or how I had traveled such a distance without being aware. Shaken, I pulled into a dimly lit rest stop to gather my thoughts. Checking my logbook, I confirmed that I had covered a remarkable distance in an impossibly short time. My watch showed hours missing, deepening the mystery. As I sat there, piecing together the events, another trucker approached. They noticed my pale complexion and shared a chilling tale of losing time on the same stretch of road. Apparently, this highway was notorious for causing bizarre episodes of lost time. Determined to unravel the mystery, I continued my journey, taking every precaution to stay alert. I blasted loud music, kept the windows open for fresh air, and took frequent breaks. Despite my efforts, An eerie sense of disorientation lingered, as if the road itself held a supernatural power. Later that night, strange lights appeared in my rearview mirror, darting and weaving. Panic set in as the lights vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving me questioning my own senses. When I finally reached my destination, the experience haunted me. The mystery of the lost time and the eerie lights remained unsolved, a reminder of the strange and unexplained phenomena lurking on the open road. Sharing my story with fellow drivers, I discovered I wasn't alone. Tales of that highway's eerie power continued to circulate, leaving us all to wonder what truly happens during those lost hours. My mother was the heart of our family, a beacon of warmth and kindness. When she disappeared one cold night, the dread that settled over us was unbearable. We searched everywhere, but as days turned into weeks, our hope began to fade. Then, the phone call came. The police had found her body in a desolate stretch of highway, concealed in a remote area off the interstate. She had been strangled, the life cruelly snatched away by a monster who used the anonymity of the roads to his advantage. The truck driver responsible was known as the Interstate Strangler. His method was horrifyingly systematic. He would lure women traveling alone with offers of help or a ride, then use his truck as a mobile killing chamber. The refrigerated compartments of his truck provided a chilling method to preserve his victims, complicating the investigation and giving him more time to evade capture. The police pieced together his pattern through painstaking work. He had been on the run for years, moving from state to state, his truck filled with hidden horrors. The sheer scale of his crimes was revealed only after he was finally caught, and the details of his spree were horrifying. During the trial, the courtroom was charged with tension. The prosecution laid out a chilling account of how he operated, detailing his method of targeting and killing his victims. Each revelation was more disturbing than the last, painting a grim picture of the terror he inflicted. When it was his turn to speak, his cold, indifferent demeanor was shocking. Asked about his actions, he responded, "I didn't do anything wrong. They trusted me, and that was their mistake. I did what I needed to survive." His lack of remorse was a slap in the face to the families who had been shattered by his actions. He was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life without parole. The verdict was a small measure of justice, but it did little to mend the gaping wound left by his crimes. The trial was a harsh reminder of the evil that can lurk in the most unexpected places. I've been a long-haul truck driver for years, used to the solitude of the open road. One night, I was hauling a load through a desolate stretch of highway, miles from the nearest town. The only company I had was the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the CB radio. As midnight approached, a dense fog rolled in, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The road was eerily quiet, and an unsettling feeling crept over me. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the journey ahead. Suddenly, I saw a figure standing on the shoulder, barely visible in the fog. I slowed down, thinking it might be someone in need, but as I got closer, the figure vanished into thin air. Confused, I continued driving, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the light. A few miles later, I felt a strange chill inside the cab, as if the temperature had dropped. The radio flickered, static filling the silence. I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. There, in the back seat, was a shadowy figure watching me. Heart pounding, I swerved, nearly losing control. When I looked again, the figure was gone. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Was I overtired, or was something more sinister at play? I decided to pull over at the next truck stop to clear my head. As I parked, I noticed other truckers exchanging uneasy glances, whispering about strange happenings on the road. Inside the dimly lit diner, I overheard stories of a ghostly presence haunting the stretch of highway. Truckers spoke of a mysterious figure appearing in their rigs, vanishing without a trace. They called it the Phantom Hitchhiker. Some claimed it was the spirit of a trucker who had died in a crash years ago, doomed to wander the roads forever. Others said it was a warning, a sign to be careful on these treacherous paths. Despite the rational part of my mind dismissing these tales, I couldn't shake the feeling that something supernatural was happening. I returned to my truck, determined to finish my route and put the night behind me. As I drove on, The fog thickened, wrapping the world in a blanket of gray. My grip tightened on the wheel, and I kept glancing at the mirror, half expecting to see the figure return. Suddenly, the fog parted, revealing a sharp bend in the road. I slammed the brakes just in time, heart racing from the near miss as I steadied the truck. The radio crackled to life, a voice whispering my name. Terrified, I sped up, desperate to leave the haunted highway behind. The whispers grew louder, filling the cab with an unearthly presence. Just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, the fog lifted, and the road opened up before me. When I finally reached my destination, I was exhausted, but relieved to be off that cursed road. The experience left me shaken, a reminder of the mysteries that lurk in the darkness. I still drive those long, lonely highways, but I'm always on guard, wary of the shadows that hide in the fog. Whether it was a ghost or a figment of my imagination, that night taught me to respect the unknown and to be cautious on the road less traveled. I was driving my truck down a dark, deserted highway, miles from the nearest town. The night was quiet, with only the hum of the engine breaking the silence. The road stretched on, flanked by dense forests on either side. It was the kind of night where even the stars seemed to hide, leaving the world cloaked in an unsettling darkness. Suddenly, in my rearview mirror, I noticed strange lights trailing behind me. At first, I thought it was another vehicle, but the lights didn't behave normally. They hovered, darted, and weaved in erratic patterns. My heart began to race as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Were my eyes playing tricks on me? Determined to understand, I pulled over to the side of the road. The lights vanished, leaving me alone in the oppressive darkness. I stepped out, the cold night air prickling my skin. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves. I scanned the horizon, but saw nothing unusual. The eerie stillness was unsettling, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Back on the road, the lights reappeared, dancing in the sky like ghostly fireflies. Panic set in, but curiosity drove me to continue. I remembered hearing stories from other truckers about phantom lights along this stretch of highway, tales I had dismissed as exaggerations. Now, faced with the inexplicable, those stories seemed all too real. As I approached a sharp curve, the lights suddenly shot upward, disappearing into the night sky. I felt a chill run down my spine. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension. I was left questioning everything I knew about this road and the unseen forces at play. When I reached the next truck stop, I shared my experience with fellow drivers. Many nodded knowingly, recounting similar encounters. Some believed it was a natural phenomenon, while others whispered of UFOs, and theories abounded, each more unsettling than the last. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon when I decided to kill some time at the mall. The place was bustling with shoppers, families, and teenagers hanging out. After wandering aimlessly for a while, I found myself drawn to a section of the mall I hadn't visited in years. Tucked away in a quiet corner was an old, vintage photo booth. The booth looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, with faded paint and peeling stickers. It was out of place among the modern stores and kiosks, and something about it piqued my curiosity. I decided to step inside and take a few photos for nostalgia's sake. As I closed the curtain behind me, the tiny space felt almost claustrophobic. The interior was dimly lit, and the seat was worn and uncomfortable. I inserted a few coins, and the machine whirred to life with a mechanical hum. The screen in front of me flickered, displaying the countdown. 3, 2, 1. I smiled for the first photo, trying to make the most of the quaint experience. The flash went off, and I waited for the next countdown. As the second flash went off, I thought I saw a shadow flicker on the screen, but I dismissed it as a trick of the light. By the time the fourth photo was taken, I felt a strange chill run down my spine. The booth seemed colder, and the air felt heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I quickly collected my printed photos and stepped out of the booth, eager to get back to the lively mall atmosphere. As I looked at the strip of photos, my heart skipped a beat. In the first photo, I was alone, smiling awkwardly at the camera. But in the second photo, a faint, ghostly figure appeared behind me, barely visible, but unmistakably there. In the third photo, the figure was closer, and in the fourth, it was right next to me, its face an eerie blur. A wave of fear washed over me. I looked around, half expecting to see someone or something lurking nearby, but the mall was as busy as ever. I showed the photos to a few friends, but they just laughed it off, thinking it was some sort of malfunction or a prank. Determined to find an explanation, I spoke to one of the mall's security guards. He listened to my story with a serious expression and then shared a chilling piece of information. The photo booth had a reputation for being haunted. Years ago, a young girl had gone missing in the mall, and her last known location was near that photo booth. Since then, numerous people had reported seeing strange figures in their photos. Despite the guard's warnings, I couldn't resist the urge to investigate further. Over the next few weeks, I spent hours near the booth, watching other people use it and collecting their stories. Some saw nothing unusual, but others reported similar experiences: ghostly figures, cold chills, and an overwhelming sense of dread. One night, I decided to take one last set of photos. As I sat in the booth, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The countdown began, and with each flash, the sense of unease grew. When I stepped out and looked at the photos, I saw it again, the same ghostly figure, now clearer than ever. I left the mall that night, vowing never to return to that eerie photo booth. Of shoppers without much trouble. After visiting a few stores, we found ourselves at the central atrium, where a large, decorative fountain captured my nephew's attention. It was one of his favorite spots, a place where kids would gather to throw coins and make wishes. As always, he was eager to join them. "Stay close," I reminded him as he dashed towards the fountain, his little red jacket bobbing through the crowd. I followed a few steps behind, momentarily distracted by a store display. When I looked back, he was gone. Panic gripped me. I called his name, but there was no response. Frantically, I scanned the crowd, my eyes darting from one face to another. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I hurried to the information desk to report him missing. The staff immediately alerted security, and within minutes, they were searching the mall. Time seemed to slow down. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for any news. The loudspeaker announcements described him perfectly, but there was no sign of him. My mind raced with horrible possibilities. Where could he be? Just when I was starting to lose hope, a security guard approached with my nephew in tow. Relief washed over me as I ran to him, pulling him into a tight hug. He looked unharmed, but clearly shaken. When I asked him where he had been, his story sent chills down my spine. He said he had followed a little girl who was crying, thinking she was lost and needed help. She had led him down a series of corridors he had never seen before, eventually taking him to a dimly lit, abandoned section of the mall. Then, without warning, she vanished. My nephew tried to find his way back, but ended up lost and alone, until the security guard found him near a service exit. None of it made sense. How could he have ended up in an abandoned part of the mall? When I questioned the security team, they seemed as puzzled as I was. According to them, there were no accessible abandoned areas, and all maintenance zones were securely locked. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. My nephew's vivid account of the crying girl seemed too real to be a figment of his imagination. In the following days, I did some research and discovered something deeply unsettling. Decades ago, a little girl had gone missing in that very mall under mysterious circumstances. She was never found, and rumors persisted that her spirit still wandered the mall, seeking help. I had no intention of going to the mall that Saturday. The sky was a gloomy shade of gray, and a storm was brewing, making the idea of a cozy day at home seem far more appealing. But I needed a gift for my friend's birthday, and the mall was my only option. The mall was packed, as usual, with people seeking shelter from the impending storm. The air was thick with the hum of chatter and the occasional crackle of the intercom. I navigated through the crowds, my mind already set on grabbing the gift and leaving as quickly as possible. After an hour of shopping, I felt the need for a quick break. My feet ached from wandering around, and the lines at the checkout counters seemed endless. That's when I spotted the restroom sign, pointing down a long, dimly lit hallway. It seemed like the perfect escape from the chaos. As I walked down the hallway, the noise of the mall began to fade, replaced by an eerie silence. The hallway felt unnervingly long, each step echoing off the walls. Finally, I reached the restroom door and pushed it open. It creaked loudly, the sound almost deafening in the quiet. Inside, the restroom was starkly different from the rest of the mall. The lighting was dim, casting long shadows across the tiled floor. A row of sinks lined one wall, and a few stalls stood at the far end. The air was cold, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I chose a stall and locked the door behind me. Almost immediately, I felt a strange sense of unease, but I dismissed it as just the restroom being chilly. After all, mall restrooms weren't exactly known for their comfort. As I finished up, I heard a faint whisper. I froze, straining to hear. The whispering grew louder. Though I couldn't make out any words, my heart began to race. I told myself it was just the air conditioning or water pipes, but the whispers continued, seeming to come from right outside my stall. Quickly, I unlocked the door and stepped out into the main area of the restroom. There was no one there. The stalls were all empty, and the whispering had stopped. Trying to shake off the eerie feeling, I walked over to the sink to wash my hands. As I looked into the mirror, I saw a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the restroom. My blood ran cold. The figure was indistinct, more like a dense, dark fog than a person. I spun around to confront whatever it was, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. Heart pounding, I turned back to the mirror. The shadowy figure was gone. I hurriedly washed my hands, eager to leave. But just as I was about to turn off the tap, the lights began to flicker. The flickering was rapid and erratic, casting bizarre, shifting shadows around the room. I grabbed my things and rushed to the door, only to find it wouldn't open. Panic set in as I tugged harder, but it was as if the door was jammed or being held shut from the other side. The whispering returned, louder this time, and I could clearly hear my name being called. Suddenly, the lights went out completely. I was plunged into darkness, my only light coming from the faint glow of my phone screen. I used it as a flashlight, sweeping the beam around the room. That's when I saw the shadowy figure again, closer this time, standing in the middle of the restroom. I backed away, my hands shaking, desperately trying to open the door. Then, as abruptly as they had gone out, the lights flickered back on. The figure was gone, and the door swung open easily under my touch. I bolted out of the restroom and didn't stop until I was back in the crowded mall, surrounded by people. Breathless, I looked back towards the hallway. It appeared normal, nothing out of the ordinary. I thought about telling someone, but what could I say? That I saw a ghost in the restroom. I decided to keep it to myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Since that day, I've avoided that particular restroom. I've heard rumors from other shoppers and employees about strange occurrences in that part of the mall: flickering lights, cold spots, and eerie whispers. Some even claimed to have seen the same shadowy figure. Whatever it was, I'm convinced it wasn't just my imagination. The memory of that shadowy figure still haunts me, and I've learned to trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right. The mall, once a place of routine errands and leisure, now holds an unsettling memory that I'll never forget. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening at the mall with friends. We had spent the day shopping and decided to grab a bite to eat at the food court before heading home. As we were finishing our meal, someone suggested checking out a new store on the top floor. We all agreed, eager to explore. We made our way to the nearest elevator. It was one of the older models, with metal doors and a faint smell of oil. We crowded inside, excited for our last stop of the day. One of us pressed the button for the top floor, and the doors slid shut with a clunk. As the elevator began to ascend, we laughed and joked, enjoying each other's company. Suddenly, the elevator jolted violently, causing us to stumble. We exchanged uneasy glances, but it was clear the elevator had malfunctioned before. The elevator came to a sudden stop, and the lights flickered. We looked at each other puzzled. I tried pressing the button to continue our journey, but it remained unresponsive. An eerie silence filled the space, broken only by the soft hum of the malfunctioning lights. Then we started to hear it whispers. At first, They were so faint that we thought it was just the sound of the malfunctioning machinery, but as the whispers grew louder, they became distinct and unsettling. The voices seemed to be laughing and talking, but no one else was in the elevator with us. The sounds came from all directions, echoing around us. My friends and I tried to stay calm. We called for help, but our phones had no signal. The laughter grew louder, more sinister. It was as if someone or something was playing with us from the shadows. The temperature in the elevator dropped suddenly, and we could see our breath in the cold air. We huddled together, trying to reassure each other, but then, the elevator lurched again, moving erratically. It seemed to drop and rise without warning, sending us all into a state of panic. We braced ourselves against the walls, holding onto each other for support. The whispers turned into mocking laughter, growing more frantic and chaotic. It felt as though an invisible presence was toying with us, reveling in our fear. We shouted and pounded on the doors, desperate to escape, but it was as if the elevator was taunting us, refusing to move. Just when we thought we couldn't take any more, the elevator came to a sudden, jarring stop. The light stabilized, and an eerie silence fell over us once more. The doors creaked open slowly, revealing the dimly lit hallway of the mall. We stumbled out, shaken and exhausted. The mall was eerily quiet, with no sign of the commotion we had experienced. We made our way to the nearest exit, feeling a mix of relief and disbelief. Later, we learned that the elevator had been experiencing issues for weeks. There were rumors about strange occurrences and unexplained noises, but nothing concrete. We never spoke much about that night, and we certainly never used that elevator again. I took a night shift at a toy store known for its extensive collection of antique dolls. It seemed like a straightforward job, but it quickly became anything but ordinary. The store was usually calm during the day, but at night, the atmosphere changed entirely. The first sign something was wrong came when I heard faint whispers from the doll section. At first, I chalked it up to fatigue or my imagination, but as the nights went by, the whispers grew louder, and something more disturbing began to happen. One evening, I was restocking shelves when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned to see one of the dolls, a Victorian-era porcelain figure with a delicate, haunting face seemingly shifting its position. Its eyes followed me, and its head tilted as if observing my every move. I tried to ignore it, but the doll's gaze felt unnervingly alive. As I continued my tasks, I realized that other dolls were also out of place. They weren't just moved, they were rearranged into patterns, forming eerie shapes and symbols on the shelves. It was as if they were trying to communicate something, though I couldn't make out any clear message. The whispers became more distinct, almost like a conversation. The voices were indecipherable at first, but they started to grow louder, more frantic. The temperature in the store dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath fogging in the cold air. One night, the store's lights flickered, casting long, unsettling shadows across the walls. I was in the back room, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread, when I heard a loud crash from the main floor. My heart pounded as I grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate. The sight that greeted me was chilling. The dolls were no longer in their cases. They were scattered across the floor, their faces frozen in horrifying, twisted expressions. They seemed to be arranged in a grotesque circle, with their heads turned inward. The whispering had turned into a low, guttural chant, reverberating through the store. I backed away, feeling a cold sweat break out on my forehead. As I stumbled backward, I felt a sudden, icy hand grip my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. The chanting grew louder, and I could almost make out words, though they were twisted and incomprehensible. In a panic, I tried to reassemble the dolls, but it was as if they resisted. Their limbs felt unnaturally heavy, and they seemed to move on their own. The lights flickered again, and the store was plunged into darkness for a moment. When the lights returned, the dolls were back in their cases, neatly arranged, as if nothing had happened. I fled from the store that night, my heart racing and my mind reeling. I couldn't shake the feeling that the dolls had somehow come to life, that something malevolent was trapped within them. I avoided the store for days, but the whispers and the eerie presence seemed to follow me. When I finally spoke to other night workers, I learned that they had experienced similar phenomena, dolls moving on their own, whispers echoing through the store, and an oppressive, malevolent atmosphere. Some claimed to have seen the dolls' eyes glowing in the dark, their mouths moving as if speaking in ancient, forgotten languages. It was the holiday season, and the mall was bustling with shoppers eager to pick out gifts and enjoy the festive decorations. My job was to help with the Christmas display, which was a major attraction for the mall. The display featured a massive or elaborately decorated tree and a winter wonderland scene with twinkling lights and festive ornaments. Everything was going smoothly until one night when I stayed late to finish setting up the display. As the mall emptied, the atmosphere grew quieter, but the festive decorations were still brightly lit, casting colorful reflections across the display area. I was carefully placing the final decorations when I heard an unsettling sound: soft, eerie laughter. I turned around, expecting to see someone playing a prank, but the area was empty. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the building's settling sounds or my tired imagination. The next night, I was working alone again when I noticed something odd. The ornaments on the Christmas tree had been rearranged. It wasn't just a few decorations, several were missing, and others were moved into strange, haphazard positions. I figured someone must have been messing around, so I put everything back in place. As I worked, I heard more strange noises, soft thuds, and the faint rustling of decorations as if they were being moved on their own. The lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that seemed to dance around the room. My heart started to race, and a chill ran down my spine. The third night, I was determined to get to the bottom of the disturbances. I set up a small camera to monitor the display while I worked elsewhere in the mall. The camera recorded the display area, and when I reviewed the footage, I was horrified. The video showed the decorations moving by themselves. Ornaments spun around in midair. Garlands seemed to slither across the floor, and the tree topper swayed as if someone or something was playing with it. The camera also captured fleeting shadows darting across the display, and the soft, eerie laughter that had haunted me was clearly audible in the background. I shared the footage with my colleagues, and their reactions were mixed. Some were skeptical, but others were genuinely frightened. One worker claimed to have seen a ghostly figure near the display, a shadowy shape that disappeared as soon as she looked directly at it. The story about the haunted Christmas display quickly spread through the mall. More workers reported hearing strange noises, seeing lights flicker, and feeling an icy chill near the display. The once cheerful holiday setting became a source of fear and unease. The mall management decided to investigate further, but found no technical issues with the lighting or sound systems. Despite their efforts, the disturbances continued. Eventually, they decided to temporarily dismantle the display, citing safety concerns. The eerie occurrences seemed to stop after that. I remember it like it was yesterday. After gym class, I headed to the locker room to change back into my regular clothes. It was always a bit creepy in there, but that day, something felt different. The air was colder than usual, and a strange silence filled the room. As I stood in front of the mirror, I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and in the dim reflection, I saw her, a girl about our age, standing just behind me. Her eyes were hollow, and she had an eerie, sad expression on her face. She was dressed in an old-fashioned school uniform that looked out of place. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. My heart was pounding, and I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But when I looked back at the mirror, she was still there, closer this time. Her lips moved as if she was trying to say something, but no sound came out. Panic set in, and I grabbed my things and ran out of the locker room. I didn't tell anyone at first, afraid they'd think I was crazy, but later, I found out I wasn't the only one who had seen her. Other students had reported similar experiences, always in front of the mirror in the locker room. We started piecing together the stories and learned that years ago, a girl had tragically died in that very locker room. Since then, her spirit has been trapped there, trying to reach out to anyone who would listen. To this day, I avoid that locker room if I can. The memory of her haunting reflection is something I'll never forget. It was a late autumn evening when it all started. My friends and I had decided to stay after school to practice for the upcoming basketball game. The old gym was usually deserted at that time, adding an eerie vibe to our practice sessions. That evening, as we were shooting hoops, we heard a faint noise coming from the other end of the gym. At first, we brushed it off as the wind or an old building creaking, but then the noises grew louder and more distinct. It sounded like footsteps and soft whispers. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to investigate. We walked towards the source of the sounds, which seemed to be coming from the storage room at the far end of the gym. As we approached, the air grew colder, and an unsettling feeling crept over us. When we reached the storage room, the door was slightly ajar. We pushed it open, and that's when we saw a faint, ghostly figure of a man. He was dressed in what looked like an old gym uniform and was pacing back and forth. His face was expressionless, and he seemed completely unaware of our presence. One of my friends whispered, "Do you see that?" And we all nodded, too scared to move or speak loudly. Suddenly, the figure stopped pacing and turned towards us. We froze in terror, expecting the worst, but instead of approaching us, he simply vanished into thin air. We stood there, stunned and unable to process what we had just witnessed. Eventually, we gathered our wits and ran out of the gym as fast as we could. When we shared our experience with the school staff, they revealed that years ago, a beloved gym teacher had passed away unexpectedly, and ever since, strange occurrences had been reported in the gym. It started during my sophomore year. Room 303 had always been the subject of ghost stories, but I never took them seriously until I experienced it myself. One late afternoon, I stayed behind to finish an assignment. The classroom was eerily silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. As the shadows lengthened and the daylight faded, I heard a faint scratching sound, like chalk against the blackboard. I turned around, expecting to see a teacher or another student, but the room was empty. Yet, the chalk was moving on its own, uttering something in elegant, old-fashioned script. My heart raced as I approached, trying to make out the words. Just as I got close enough to read it, the chalk dropped, and the temperature in the room plummeted. A chill ran down my spine, and I could see my breath fogging in the cold air. I wanted to run, but curiosity held me in place. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake off what I had seen. Desks would shift, books would fly off shelves, and there were whispers, soft, mournful whispers that sent shivers down my spine. Determined to uncover the truth, I convinced a couple of friends to stay after school with me one evening. Armed with a camera, we set up in room 303, our nerves on edge. Hours ticked by, and just when we were about to call it a night, the air grew heavy and cold. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows around the room. Then we heard a low, sorrowful humming coming from the back of the room. We turned, our hearts pounding, and saw a ghostly figure of a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, standing by the window. Her face was pale, eyes hollow, and filled with sadness. She moved slowly, almost gliding, towards the blackboard. Frozen in place, we watched as she picked up a piece of chalk and began to write. This time, we could see the words clearly. "Help me." Her voice, barely more than a whisper, echoed in the silence. "Help me." Panic set in, but before we could react, she vanished, leaving us in stunned silence. We later discovered that decades ago, a beloved teacher had disappeared under mysterious circumstances in room 303. No one ever found her, and the case went cold. The school eventually sealed off room 303, but the memory of that ghostly figure and her desperate plea for help haunts us to this day. It's a chilling reminder that some spirits remain bound to this world, seeking the closure they never found in life. When I was in elementary school, the playground was my sanctuary, a place of joy and laughter. But there was one part of the playground that no one ventured near, the old, abandoned swing set at the far end. It stood like a forgotten relic, rusting and creaking ominously in the wind. The stories surrounding it were whispered in hushed tones, and no one dared to approach it. One overcast afternoon, my friends and I were playing tag. I sprinted away, losing myself in the game, until I realized I was heading straight for the old swing set. As I drew closer, an eerie silence fell over the playground, and I could hear faint, chilling laughter in the distance. The sound sent a shiver down my spine. It was the unmistakable laughter of children, but there was no one around. My heart raced as I cautiously approached the swing set. There, in the fading light, I saw them. Two ghostly figures of children, swinging slowly back and forth. Their faces were pale and their eyes hollow, yet they seemed to be laughing and playing. The sight froze me in place, my feet rooted to the ground in fear. Suddenly, one of the figures turned its head towards me. The laughter stopped, replaced by a haunting whisper that seemed to echo all around me. "Help us," they murmured, their voices filled with sorrow and desperation. I wanted to run, but I was paralyzed with terror. As I stood there, the temperature around me seemed to drop, and the air grew thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. The ghostly children continued to whisper, their pleas growing more urgent. The swing set began to creak loudly, the chains clinking in a rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. Summoning every ounce of courage, I took a hesitant step closer. The moment I did, the ghostly figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into the misty air. The swings continued to move on their own, swaying gently as if pushed by unseen hands. I bolted back to my friends, breathless and shaken. I tried to tell them what I had seen, but they laughed it off, thinking I was trying to scare them. But I knew the truth. Determined to understand, I approached the school janitor, an old man who had worked at the school for decades. With a grave expression, he told me the story. Decades ago, two children had vanished without a trace while playing on that very swing set. Despite extensive searches, they were never found. Some believed they had been taken, while others whispered of dark, supernatural forces at work. The swing set was left untouched, a silent memorial to the lost children. From that day on, I avoided the old swing set, but the memory of the ghostly children and their desperate whispers haunted me. The playground, once a place of joy, had become a place of fear and sorrow. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can still hear their faint laughter mingled with mournful whispers, echoing across the deserted playground. The thought that their spirits remain trapped, endlessly seeking help, is a chilling reminder of the unknown forces that lurk in the shadows. It was supposed to be a routine day at school. I was working on a group project with some classmates in the old science lab, a place that had been unused for years and was always a bit eerie. The lab was filled with dusty equipment, and the windows barely let in any light. As we worked, we heard an odd noise coming from the back of the room. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. We tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the old building settling, but the noise grew louder and more distinct. Curiosity got the best of us, and we decided to investigate. We split up, with one of my friends checking the storage closet while the rest of us looked around the room. I was inspecting some old equipment on a shelf when I felt a cold breeze and heard a faint whisper. I turned around, but no one was there. The noise from the back of the room continued, and it sounded like someone or something was moving around. My friend who had checked the storage closet came back looking pale. He said the closet door had slammed shut by itself while he was inside. We were all on edge. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. Panic set in as we fumbled for our phones to use as flashlights. The only light came from the dim glow of our screens, casting eerie shadows on the walls. In the dim light, we saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. It was tall and indistinct, moving slowly. We could hear the sound of shuffling footsteps coming closer, and the air grew colder. My heart was racing as I tried to make out what the figure was. One of my friends shouted, "Who's there?" But the figure didn't respond. Instead, it seemed to glide towards us, leaving a trail of cold air in its wake. The whispering grew louder, filling the room with a chorus of unintelligible voices. Later, we learned from a teacher that the old science lab had a dark history. Years ago, it was the site of a tragic accident involving a student who had been working alone late at night. Some said the student's spirit was still trapped there, unable to move on. We never returned to the lab, and the story of that day became a chilling legend among the students. The old science lab remains locked and unused, a haunting reminder of the mysterious and unsettling events that happened within its walls. Later, I learned more about the tragic accident that occurred in the old science lab. The story was that many years ago, a student had been working alone on a chemistry experiment late at night. The student was known for being meticulous and dedicated to their work, but on that particular evening, something went terribly wrong. The experiment involved a highly volatile chemical compound. According to the accounts, the student was trying to mix chemicals to create a new formula. There was an unexpected reaction, something that the student had not anticipated. The mixture exploded, causing a fire that quickly engulfed the lab. The student was trapped inside, and despite the emergency response, they were unable to escape in time. The aftermath was devastating. The lab was heavily damaged, and the student's life was tragically cut short. The incident was hushed up, and the lab was closed off. Over the years, there were rumors that the student's spirit lingered in the lab, unable to find peace due to the traumatic end of their life. This history cast a dark shadow over the lab, and the stories we heard about the noises and the shadowy figure seemed to fit with the tragic events of the past. The ghostly presence we encountered might have been that of the student, still trapped in the place where their life ended in such a tragic and sudden manner. It was an ordinary day at school, and I had to visit the principal's office for a minor issue. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed the new substitute principal had taken over the office. I had heard unsettling rumors about him, but I didn't think much of it at the time. When I entered the office, the room was dimly lit, with shadows dancing across the walls. The substitute principal sat behind his desk, his face partially obscured by the low light. He looked up as I walked in, his eyes sharp and unnervingly intense. I took a seat, and he began questioning me about the issue I was there for. His demeanor was cold and scrutinizing. As I spoke, I couldn't help but notice a large, old photograph hanging on the wall behind him. It was a black and white portrait of a man in an old-fashioned suit, his expression stern and foreboding. The longer I stared at the photograph, the more it felt like the eyes of the man were following me. My unease grew as the substitute principal's questions became more probing and personal. I could hear an odd, soft whispering that seemed to come from nowhere, adding to my discomfort. Suddenly, the room's lights flickered and went out, plunging us into near darkness. The substitute principal's voice became a chilling whisper as he leaned closer. "Do you believe in ghosts?" he asked, his tone both unsettling and sinister. My heart raced. I wanted to get out of there, but I felt paralyzed by fear. The air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath forming in the dim light. The photograph on the wall seemed to take on a ghostly glow, and the whispering grew louder, more urgent. The door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. I jumped, my pulse racing as I looked around in panic. The substitute principal remained seated, his gaze fixed on me with an unsettling calmness. "You should go now," he said in a voice that sent shivers down my spine. I didn't need to be told twice. I fled from the office, my heart pounding in my chest. Later, I discovered that the photograph was of the previous principal, who had mysteriously disappeared years ago. The substitute principal's eerie behavior and the ghostly whispers seemed to be connected to the unsolved mystery of the former principal's disappearance. Later, I learned more about the disturbing history behind the photograph of the previous principal. The story was far more chilling than I had imagined. Years ago, the former principal had been a respected figure at the school, known for his strict but fair approach. However, one day, he vanished without a trace. The school was thrown into chaos as a massive search was launched, but no evidence was found. The disappearance remained a mystery, and rumors began to circulate. Some said the principal had been involved in a secret investigation, or that he had crossed someone powerful. Others whispered about an underground network operating within the school's old buildings. The most unsettling theory, however, was that the principal had discovered something sinister about the school's administration or history and had been silenced before he could expose it. As the years passed, the principal's disappearance was shrouded in secrecy, with few details ever coming to light. The school eventually moved on, but the principal's office, where the photograph hung, was avoided by most students and staff due to its unsettling atmosphere. It wasn't until I encountered the substitute principal that the chilling details began to surface. The ghostly presence in the office seemed to be connected to the former principal's tragic end. Many believed the principal's spirit was still trapped there, unable to move on because of the unresolved mysteries surrounding his disappearance. The eerie encounter I had, combined with the stories of the principal's disappearance, suggested that the substitute principal might have been more than just an ordinary person. Perhaps he was connected to the unresolved past, or maybe he was a manifestation of the principal's restless spirit seeking answers. I always loved the library. It was my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the chaos of school life and lose myself in a good book. But everything changed one late afternoon during my junior year. I stayed late to finish a research paper. The library was nearly empty, just the way I liked it. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow through the windows, and the only sound was the faint rustle of pages turning. As I was engrossed in my book, I heard a soft whisper. I looked up, but there was no one around. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, coming from the rows of shelves behind me. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I walked down the narrow aisles, my footsteps echoing softly on the polished floor. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. My heart began to race as I turned a corner and saw a book fall off the shelf on its own. I froze, my mind racing to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was just gravity or a loose shelf. But as I picked up the book, the whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I quickly placed the book back and hurried to my table, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. Over the next few days, strange things continued to happen. Books would fly off the shelves, and sometimes, I'd catch glimpses of a shadowy figure moving through the stacks. My friends thought I was imagining things, but I knew what I had seen and heard. Determined to find out what was going on, I stayed late again, this time with the camera. I set it up facing the section where the strange occurrences had been happening and waited. Hours passed, and just when I thought nothing would happen, the whispers started again, louder and more frantic. I watched in horror as several books flew off the shelves simultaneously, and then I saw a ghostly figure, barely visible, moving between the rows of books. It seemed to be searching for something or someone. The figure stopped and turned towards me, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. I felt a wave of sadness and longing wash over me before it vanished into thin air. Shaken, I reviewed the footage and saw everything I had witnessed. I took it to the librarian, who listened quietly before telling me about the library's tragic past. Years ago, a student had disappeared in the library, never to be seen again. Many believed their spirit was still trapped, searching for a way out or for someone to help them. The library remains a place of mystery and unease for me now. I still visit, but I'm always on edge, waiting for the whispers to start again. The ghostly figure's desperate search haunts me. One night, I was on a long haul route, making my way to a warehouse for a late-night delivery. The journey had been uneventful, and I was looking forward to unloading and getting some rest. I pulled into the warehouse lot, parked my truck, and walked up to the office to check in. I handed over my paperwork to the staff, but they looked confused. They checked their system and told me they had no record of my delivery. I was sure I had the right place, so I double-checked the address and the details. Everything matched up perfectly. I insisted they look again, but they still couldn't find any record of my delivery or the items I was carrying. Frustrated, I asked them to come and inspect the load themselves. We walked back to my truck, and I opened the trailer doors. To my shock, the trailer was completely empty. The entire load I had been transporting had vanished without a trace. The warehouse staff were just as baffled as I was. There were no signs of forced entry, and the seals on the trailer were intact. I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew for certain that the trailer had been loaded when I left, and I had made no stops along the way. It was as if the freight had simply disappeared into thin air. The staff suggested I call my dispatcher to report the incident. When I did, they were equally confused and concerned. They assured me they would look into it, but for the time being, I was left with more questions than answers. I drove to a nearby truck stop, still trying to wrap my head around what had happened. As I sat in my cab, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something unnatural had taken place. The missing freight remained a mystery, and despite numerous investigations, it was never found. To this day, I have no explanation for what occurred that night. It was as if the load had been spirited away by some unseen force. The incident left me with a lingering sense of unease, and every time I make a delivery, I can't help but wonder if it will happen again. One night, I was driving my truck down a long, deserted highway. It was past midnight, and the road was eerily quiet. I was in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but darkness, and the hum of my engine for company. Suddenly, I noticed something strange in my rearview mirror. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, approaching rapidly. At first, I thought it was just another vehicle, but as it got closer, I realized there was something off about it. The lights were blindingly bright, and they seemed to be floating just above the ground. The vehicle got closer and closer, until it was right on my tail. I tried to speed up, but it matched my pace, staying just a few feet behind me. I could feel a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I decided to pull over and let the vehicle pass, but when I did, it vanished. There was no sign of it anywhere. I looked around, confused and a little shaken, but there was nothing on the road except my truck and the empty highway stretching into the distance. I got back on the road, trying to shake off the unease, but the headlights reappeared almost immediately, this time in front of me. They hovered for a moment before darting off to the side and disappearing into the darkness. As I continued driving, strange things started happening. The radio crackled with static, and I heard faint whispers that seemed to be coming from the speakers. The temperature in the cab dropped, and I could see my breath in the cold air. Then, out of nowhere, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, coming to a screeching halt just inches away from the person. But when I got out to check, there was no one there. The road was empty again. I decided to keep driving, determined to reach my destination as quickly as possible. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the experience left me rattled. When I finally arrived at my delivery point, I was exhausted and on edge. I later learned that the stretch of highway I had been driving on was notorious for strange occurrences. There had been numerous reports of ghostly headlights, unexplained figures, and other paranormal phenomena. Some said it was the site of a terrible accident many years ago, and that the spirits of those who died still haunted the road. Even now, I can't explain what I saw that night. The memory of those ghostly headlights and the strange events that followed still haunt me, and I avoid that highway whenever I can. The experience left me with a deep sense of unease, and a belief that there are things out there that can't be explained by logic or reason. One night, I was on a long-haul route, driving through a remote stretch of road that cut through a dense forest. It was the kind of place where the trees seemed to close in on either side, and the only light came from my truck's headlights slicing through the darkness. Around midnight, I saw a sign for a rest area up ahead. Feeling the fatigue setting in, I decided to pull over and take a short break. The rest area was small and deserted, with a couple of picnic tables and a single streetlight casting a dim glow. I parked my truck and stepped out to stretch my legs. As I walked around, I noticed an old, beat-up car parked in the corner, half hidden by the trees. It looked like it had been there for a long time, covered in rust and leaves. I felt a chill run down my spine, but brushed it off as just the eerie atmosphere. After a few minutes, I heard a faint sound coming from the direction of the car. It was a low, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on metal. I froze, straining my ears to listen. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. I cautiously approached the car, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, the tapping grew louder. I peered through the grimy windows, but it was too dark to see anything inside. Summoning my courage, I reached for the door handle and pulled. The door creaked open, and I was hit by a musty, stale smell. Inside, the car was empty, but the tapping noise continued, now seeming to come from the trunk. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to walk away, but curiosity got the better of me. I went around to the back of the car and tried the trunk. It was locked. I searched the ground for something to pry it open, and found a rusty crowbar nearby. With a deep breath, I wedged it under the trunk lid and pushed. The trunk sprang open with a groan, and I stumbled back, the tapping noise stopping abruptly. Inside, there was nothing but old, decaying junk. Piles of papers, clothes, and what looked like an old doll stared back at me. I felt a wave of relief and confusion wash over me. Just as I was about to close the trunk, I noticed a piece of paper sticking out from under the debris. I pulled it free and saw it was a photograph of a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl, all smiling happily. But there was something unsettling about their eyes, which seemed to follow me wherever I moved. I shoved the photo back into the trunk and slammed it shut. The tapping had stopped, but the eerie feeling lingered. I hurried back to my truck, eager to get away from the rest area. As I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, I glanced in my rearview mirror. To my horror, I saw the figure of a little girl standing by the old car, staring directly at me. Her eyes were hollow and dark, and her expression was one of sadness and longing. I sped up, watching as she faded into the darkness, the rest area disappearing behind me. The rest of my drive was filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. When I finally reached my destination, I couldn't shake the image of that girl from my mind. I later learned that years ago, a family had disappeared in that area, their car found abandoned at the same rest stop. I still think about that night and wonder if I encountered the spirits of that lost family. The experience left me with a deep unease and a reluctance to stop at remote rest areas alone at night. One late night, I was driving my truck down a lonely stretch of highway. The road was empty, and the only sound was the steady hum of my engine. It was just me, the road, and the occasional crackle of static on the radio. As I was passing through a desolate canyon, I suddenly heard something strange. At first, it was faint, like the wind whispering through the trees, but as I drove further, the sound grew clearer. It was a woman's voice, soft and melodic, singing an old, haunting melody. I glanced at my radio, thinking it had picked up some late-night station, but the display showed nothing but static. The singing continued, the voice seeming to come from all around me. It was beautiful yet unsettling, and I couldn't understand the words, but the tune was deeply melancholic. Curious and a bit unnerved, I slowed down, trying to pinpoint the source of the singing. As I rounded a bend in the road, the voice grew louder, almost as if the singer was right beside me. I scanned the area with my headlights, but there was no one in sight, just the empty road and the towering canyon walls. I kept driving, hoping the voice would fade, but it followed me, never wavering. The singing seemed to wrap around me, filling the cab of my truck with its haunting melody. My heart began to race, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Desperate to shake off the eerie feeling, I turned up the volume on my radio, trying to drown out the voice with static and noise. But it didn't help. The singing persisted, clear and undisturbed by the cacophony. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white, and pressed on the gas, wanting to get out of the canyon as quickly as possible. The voice stayed with me, unrelenting, until I finally saw the canyon walls open up, and the road stretch out into the open desert. As I exited the canyon, the singing abruptly stopped. The silence was jarring, and I almost wished the voice would come back. I drove a few more miles before pulling over to the side of the road, my hands shaking. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself. One evening, I was driving my truck through a remote and desolate stretch of highway. The road was long and straight, with nothing but darkness on either side. The night was quiet, and the only sound was the steady rumble of my engine. As I drove, I noticed an unusual drop in temperature inside the cab. I could see my breath forming in the cold air, which seemed out of place given that it was a relatively mild night. I shrugged it off, thinking it might be a draft or an issue with the truck's climate control. Just then, I felt a sudden, unseen force grip my shoulder. It wasn't a physical touch, but rather an intense pressure, as if someone or something was pressing down on me. I was startled and quickly glanced around, but there was no one in the cab with me. The sensation persisted, making it difficult to concentrate on the road. I tried to shake it off and focus on driving, but the pressure seemed to intensify, almost as if it was trying to pull me away from the wheel. My heart raced, and I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to maintain control. As I drove, the air grew colder, and the eerie feeling of being watched intensified. I kept glancing in the mirrors, expecting to see someone or something behind me, but there was nothing there. The only other sign of life was the occasional flash of my headlights illuminating the empty road ahead. Eventually, saw the lights of a small town in the distance. The moment I entered the town's limits, The cold air and the pressure on my shoulder abruptly vanished. The whispers stopped, and the atmosphere inside the cab returned to normal. One night, I was driving my truck through a fierce storm. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind was howling, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. The road was slick, and I was focusing intently on keeping control of the truck. As I drove, I noticed a figure standing by the roadside, barely visible through the pouring rain. It was a man in a bright yellow raincoat, completely drenched, but standing perfectly still. His appearance was odd, especially given the storm's intensity. Concerned for his safety, I decided to pull over and check on him. I parked the truck and walked over to where he was standing, but when I got there, the man was nowhere to be seen. All that remained were wet footprints in the mud leading to nothing. I looked around, calling out, but there was no sign of anyone. The rain continued to pour down, and the footprints eventually began to wash away. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized that the man had disappeared without a trace. I got back in my truck, feeling unsettled, and continued on my way. The storm raged on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange had just happened. Later, I tried to make sense of what I had seen, but there was no explanation for the sudden disappearance of the man and the mysterious footprints. One evening, I was driving down a remote road, far from any towns or homes. The area was completely quiet, with only the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. As I rounded a bend, I spotted an abandoned car parked on the side of the road. The car was running, and the doors were wide open. It looked like it had been left in a hurry. I slowed down and pulled over to take a closer look, feeling a growing sense of unease. There was no sign of anyone around, and the area was unsettlingly still. I got out of my truck and approached the abandoned vehicle. Inside, the car was empty, and there were no personal belongings or obvious signs of what had happened. The engine was still idling, and the rain was beginning to fall, making the situation even more eerie. I checked the surrounding area, hoping to find some clue about the driver's whereabouts, but there was nothing. It was as if the driver had vanished into thin air. The car felt almost like a ghostly remnant of a previous occupant. Feeling uneasy, got back in my truck and continued on my way. Later, I learned that the car had been reported stolen and was connected to a missing persons case. The news made the whole experience even more unsettling, knowing that the abandoned vehicle was linked to something so serious and mysterious. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of that eerie silence and the abandoned car left on that lonely road. The whole incident has left me with a lingering sense of unease whenever I drive through remote areas. Later, I discovered more details about the abandoned car. It turned out that the vehicle had been stolen a few days before I found it. The car had belonged to a young woman who had been reported missing under mysterious circumstances. The story behind the car was tragic. The woman had been driving home from work one evening when she disappeared. The car was found not far from where I had encountered it, with no sign of her ever having left it. Investigators were baffled by the lack of evidence and leads. The abandoned car, still running with the doors open, was linked to her disappearance. Authorities later determined that the vehicle had been left there intentionally, perhaps as a clue or a message. The case attracted significant media attention, and search efforts were intensified, but the woman was never found. As the investigation continued, theories emerged that she might have been taken by someone she knew or encountered someone dangerous on that remote road. Despite numerous leads and searches, the case remained unsolved. The whole experience left me with a deep sense of foreboding. Knowing that the car was tied to such a heartbreaking story made the encounter even more unsettling. Whenever I drive through remote areas now, I can't help but think of that abandoned vehicle and the mystery surrounding it. One evening, I was home alone, catching up on some work in my study. The house was quiet, the only sound being the ticking of the clock on the wall. I was deep into my work when I noticed something unusual out of the corner of my eye. On the table beside me was a small notebook I used for jotting down ideas, but it wasn't in its usual spot. It had moved several inches from where I distinctly remembered placing it. I brushed it off, thinking I must have moved it without realizing. I continued working, but a nagging feeling of unease crept over me. I decided to take a break and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I walked back to the study, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, on the hallway floor, was another one of my notebooks, open to a page I didn't recall writing. I picked it up and scanned the page. It was filled with unfamiliar handwriting, scribbled hastily. The words made no sense, a jumble of letters and symbols. I felt a shiver run down my spine. How did this notebook end up here? And who wrote in it? Determined to shake off the eerie feeling, I returned to the study and placed the notebook back on the shelf. I sat back down at my desk, trying to focus on my work, but soon heard a faint scratching sound coming from the hallway. It was barely audible, but enough to send a chill through me. I got up and cautiously approached the hallway, my heart pounding. The scratching grew louder as I neared the end of the hall. I turned the corner and saw something that made my blood run cold. Another notebook, open on the floor, with more of that strange, unfamiliar handwriting. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The writing seemed more frantic this time, as if whoever had written it was in a state of panic. I couldn't make out any coherent words, just lines and lines of frenzied scribbles. I felt a cold draft, and realized the window at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it earlier. I shut the window and locked it, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I went back to the study, intending to pack up my things and leave the house for the night. As I entered the room, I froze. All my notebooks were scattered across the floor, each one open to a page filled with that same, unnerving handwriting. My breathing became rapid, and I backed out of the room, too scared to turn my back on the mess. I grabbed my phone and called a friend, desperate for someone to come over. While waiting, I huddled in the living room, every creak and rustle making me jump. When my friend arrived, we searched the house together, but found nothing out of place except the notebooks. We collected them all, and I decided to throw them out, unable to bear the thought of keeping them. The experience left me shaken. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night or who or what wrote in those notebooks. The memory still haunts me, and I've never kept a journal or notebook in the house since. One night, I was home alone, feeling a bit restless. I decided to take a long bath to relax. The house was quiet, with only the sound of water filling the tub echoing through the bathroom. I lit a few candles and turned off the lights, hoping the ambience would help me unwind. As I sank into the warm water, I closed my eyes and tried to clear my mind. Suddenly, I heard a faint knock. I opened my eyes, listening intently. There it was again, 3 soft knocks, coming from somewhere inside the house. I called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" but received no answer. Trying to stay calm, I convinced myself it was just the house settling. I closed my eyes again, but the knocking continued, this time louder and more insistent. I reluctantly got out of the tub, wrapped myself in a towel, and stepped into the hallway. The house felt colder than usual, and the flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls. I followed the sound of the knocking, which seemed to be coming from the living room. As I approached the living room, the knocking stopped abruptly. I stood in the doorway, scanning the room. Everything looked normal, but the silence was unnerving. I took a few steps inside, and that's when I saw a figure standing in the corner, partially hidden in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the figure was staring at me. I reached for the light switch, but when the lights came on, the figure had vanished. My heart pounded in my chest as I searched the room, but there was no one there. Checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the fear wouldn't subside. I returned to the bathroom to get dressed, my nerves on edge. Just as I was about to leave the bathroom, the knocking started again, this time right behind me. I spun around, and to my horror, I saw a message written in the condensation on the mirror, "Get out." I bolted from the bathroom, my heart racing. I grabbed my phone and called a friend, begging them to come over immediately. I waited outside, shivering in my towel, too scared to stay in the house alone. When my friend arrived, we searched the entire house, but found no signs of anyone having been there. The message on the mirror had disappeared, leaving only my terrified reflection staring back at me. To this day, I don't know who or what was in my house that night. I moved out shortly after, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The memory of those knocks and the chilling message still haunts me, a reminder that some things are better left unexplained. One late evening, I was home alone, catching up on some reading in my bedroom. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards. As I turned a page, I heard a soft humming sound. I paused, listening intently. The humming grew louder, coming from somewhere downstairs. Curiosity got the better of me, and I set my book aside. I crept down the stairs, the humming becoming clearer with each step. It sounded almost like a lullaby, but there was something unsettling about it. I followed the sound to the living room, where the noise seemed to be the loudest. To my surprise, the room was empty. The humming continued, but now, it seemed to be coming from the basement. My heart raced as I approached the basement door. I hesitated for a moment, then opened it slowly. The humming was unmistakable, echoing up from the darkness below. I grabbed a flashlight and descended the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The humming grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't a recording. It sounded like a person humming. As I reached the bottom, I swept the flashlight beam around the room. There, in the corner, was an old rocking chair that had belonged to my grandmother. It was moving slowly back and forth, creaking with each motion. The humming was coming from the chair, but there was no one sitting in it. My blood ran cold as I approached it. Suddenly, the chair stopped rocking, and the humming ceased. The basement fell into an eerie silence. I stood frozen, flashlight shaking in my hand. Then, I noticed a small, dusty box under the chair. It was something I had never seen before. I picked up the box and opened it. Inside were old photographs, letters, and a locket. The letters were written by my grandmother, and as I read through them, I realized they were love letters to a man I had never heard of. The locket contained a picture of my grandmother and this mysterious man, both smiling happily. As I stood there, piecing together this hidden part of my grandmother's past, the humming started again, softly at first, then growing louder. It was as if she was there, trying to communicate with me. The rocking chair began to move once more. One rainy evening, I was home alone, listening to the sound of raindrops tapping against the windows. I decided to spend the night catching up on some old movies. I turned off the lights, settled onto the couch, and pressed play. About halfway through the movie, the power suddenly went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and the only light came from the occasional flash of lightning. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight, and made my way to the kitchen to find some candles. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate. I reached the top of the stairs and saw the bedroom door slightly ajar. The sound was definitely coming from inside. I pushed the door open, my hand trembling. The room was empty, but the sound persisted, now seeming to come from the closet. I steeled myself and opened the closet door. Nothing. The footsteps stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I was about to turn away when I noticed something strange. The floor of the closet had faint, muddy footprints leading to the corner. As I followed the footprints, I noticed a small, old-fashioned key lying on the floor. It looked ancient, covered in rust. I picked it up, feeling a strange connection to it. Suddenly, the closet door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my phone and shone the light around, but there was nothing there. My heart raced as I opened the door and hurried back downstairs. The power came back on just as I reached the living room, and the house seemed to return to normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Later that night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I heard the footsteps again, this time in the hallway outside my bedroom. They were closer, more insistent. I clutched the key tightly in my hand, wondering what it could unlock and why it had appeared now. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and I held my breath, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, they moved away, fading into the distance. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, decided to investigate the key. I searched the house for any old locks it might fit, but found nothing. Despite my fear, I didn't bring myself to get rid of it. I keep it hidden in a drawer, a reminder of that unsettling night. One stormy night, I found myself home alone, the wind howling outside and rain pounding against the windows. The power flickered a few times, but stayed on. I decided to pass the time by organizing the attic, a task I had been putting off for months. I climbed the creaky stairs, the dim light of a single bulb barely illuminating the dusty space. As I sorted through old boxes, I stumbled upon a small, ornate chest. It was locked, but curiosity got the better of me. I remembered an old skeleton key in the kitchen drawer that might fit. I retrieved the key and, to my surprise, it worked. Inside the chest were old photographs, letters, and a delicate silver locket. The photos were of a family I didn't recognize, and the letters were dated over a century ago. They spoke of a tragic love story, of promises made and broken, and a woman who had vowed to wait for her lover's return. Suddenly, the attic light flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to see. The wind outside seemed to grow louder, almost like a wail. I felt a chill in the air, colder than the storm outside. As I was about to head back downstairs, I heard a soft, mournful sobbing coming from the far corner of the attic. My heart raced as I pointed the flashlight in that direction. There, amidst the shadows, was a faint, ghostly figure of a woman, her eyes filled with sorrow, clutching something to her chest. I wanted to run, but something held me in place. The woman looked at me, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "He's coming back. He promised." Then she faded away, leaving only the echo of her words and the lingering sadness in the air. Terrified, I grabbed the chest and bolted downstairs, locking the attic door behind me. I sat in the living room, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The storm raged on outside, but I felt an eerie calm settle over the house. The next day, I did some research and discovered that the house had once belonged to a young woman who had lost her fiancé in a tragic accident. She had died of a broken heart, waiting for him to return. The chest must have belonged to her. I decided to return the chest to the attic, hoping to bring her some peace. As I placed it back in its spot, I whispered, "He may not have returned, but your love lives on." Since then, the attic has remained quiet, and I haven't heard the sobbing again. The experience left me shaken, but also filled with a sense of compassion for the woman's undying love. Whenever a storm rolls in, I think of her, waiting patiently for her love to return, and hope she has finally found some peace. In our small-town high school, the biology teacher was renowned for his unorthodox methods and fervent passion for science. He inspired both awe and fear in his students, pushing the boundaries of the curriculum with hands-on projects that sometimes seemed to border on the dangerous. One crisp autumn morning, he announced a new, special project that would revolutionize our understanding of genetics. The air buzzed with excitement as he selected a group of students to participate, promising them extra credit and a chance to make scientific history. But the thrill soon turned into something much darker. The project initially involved experimenting with plants, but soon rumors began to circulate that something more sinister was happening. Whispers in the hallways suggested he was conducting experiments on live subjects, a notion that sent shivers down our spines. As the weeks passed, the chosen students began to change. They grew distant and secretive, often spending long hours in the lab under the teacher's watchful eye. They bore an air of haunted urgency, their eyes shadowed with fatigue and something else, fear. One stormy night, a few of us decided to uncover the truth. We snuck into the school, our hearts pounding with a mix of excitement and dread. The lab was dark, save for the eerie glow of the equipment. We found a hidden door behind a bookshelf, leading to a secret room filled with cages and strange, humming machines. The horror of what we saw was beyond comprehension. Small animals, twisted and mutated, lay in the cages. Some were still alive, whimpering softly. Papers scattered across the desk detailed grotesque experiments, blending human and animal DNA. Our biology teacher had crossed ethical boundaries in his mad quest for scientific advancement. Suddenly, the lights flickered on, and there he stood, his face a mask of cold fury. We were trapped. He tried to rationalize his actions, insisting that his work would lead to groundbreaking medical breakthroughs. But his eyes, glinting with a manic obsession, told a different story. He was consumed by his experiments, willing to sacrifice anything or anyone for his research. As we backed away, one of the mutated creatures broke free, its pained cries filling the room. In the chaos that ensued, we managed to escape, fleeing into the night. The next day, We reported everything to the school administration and the police. The ensuing investigation revealed a web of horrific practices that shocked our community. The biology teacher was arrested, facing charges of illegal experimentation and animal cruelty. The lab was dismantled, and the school implemented strict regulations to prevent anything like this from happening again. When I was 10 years old, my small-town school seemed like a haven of safety and care. Among the teachers, one stood out for his seemingly kind demeanor. He was well-liked, often going out of his way to help students and offering them special attention. At home, my situation was dire. My parents were rarely present and emotionally indifferent, making school my only escape. I clung to the stability and reassurance that this teacher provided. It started subtly. He would invite me for extra help, praising my efforts and making me feel special, but his attention quickly grew unsettling. During one particular afternoon, he asked me to stay behind for a private session to discuss some important matters. This was in a secluded area of the school, away from any watchful eyes. What happened next was chilling. He acted in a way that left me terrified. He used his power to instill fear, threatening that if I told anyone, he would ensure my family would be notified of my misbehavior. Given my family's indifference, I feared that they would not believe me or that it would only make things worse. For months, I lived in a state of constant dread. The teacher's presence became a haunting shadow over my days. The secrecy and fear trapped me in a nightmare, where every interaction with him felt like a potential threat. His manipulative threats kept me isolated and silent, as if I was caught in a web spun with fear and control. One day, he vanished without warning. His sudden departure left me with a mix of relief and haunting uncertainty. The lack of closure only amplified the trauma, as I was left to grapple with the psychological scars he had inflicted. As I grew older, the impact of those experiences was profound. The trauma from that period left a lasting mark, influencing my self-perception and relationships. Even now, at 19, the shadows of that time linger, affecting how I trust and connect with others. I was a student at high school when a new math teacher arrived. He quickly gained a reputation for his engaging and mesmerizing lectures. His classes were always full, and he seemed to have an almost magical ability to captivate his students. It wasn't long before I, too, found myself drawn to his seemingly perfect teaching style. At first, everything seemed normal. His lectures were compelling, and I felt more interested in math than ever before. But soon, something unsettling began to happen. Students, including myself, started experiencing strange feelings after his classes. We would leave the room feeling disoriented, as if something was not quite right. I was struggling in math, and was encouraged to attend his special after-school sessions. These were held in a dimly lit classroom away from the main school building. I was eager for extra help, but the atmosphere was different from any other class. His voice became hypnotic, and I felt a strange compulsion to listen and obey his instructions. Over time, I found myself increasingly drawn to his sessions, and my friends noticed I was becoming more distant and unresponsive. I started to feel as though I was losing control over my own thoughts and actions. I was caught in a disturbing cycle of compliance and confusion, unable to articulate why I felt this way. One evening, while waiting for another session, I found an old notebook in the back of the classroom. The notes were filled with disturbing references to psychological manipulation and control. It dawned on me that he was using his position not just to teach, but to exert a dark influence over us. Terrified, I tried to confront him, but his response only deepened my fears. He made me feel that my concerns were unfounded and that I was imagining things. I was too frightened to speak out, feeling trapped in a nightmare with no clear way out. During my time in high school, our literature teacher introduced a new book that seemed to promise an enriching educational experience. It was an old, leather-bound tome with strange symbols and ornate gold lettering. The teacher spoke of its historical value and unique insights, igniting a buzz of excitement among students. From the very beginning, something felt off about the book. Those who delved into its pages began experiencing disturbing changes. Students reported nightmares filled with grotesque imagery and felt an unnerving presence shadowing them throughout the day. The book's influence was subtle, but unmistakable. One student, who was particularly engrossed by the book, noticed that its content seemed to shift as she read. Passages that were once benign began to reveal disturbing, sinister themes. She felt an unsettling compulsion to read on. Even as her friends exhibited increasingly erratic behavior, some became withdrawn, while others acted out violently, claiming they saw shadowy figures lurking in the corners of their vision. When the student approached the teacher with her concerns, she was met with dismissive indifference. The teacher insisted the book was harmless and an essential part of their literary exploration. Desperate for answers, the student decided to investigate the book's origins herself. Her search revealed a chilling history. The book had been banned in multiple countries, associated with a series of mysterious disappearances and unexplained deaths. It was said to be cursed, with the power to invade the mind and manipulate thoughts. The more she read, the more she felt her grip on reality slipping away. The atmosphere at school grew increasingly menacing. Students who had been deeply affected by the book started disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Those who remained were haunted by nightmarish visions, unable to escape the pervasive sense of dread. In a desperate attempt to end the horror, the student confronted the teacher again, demanding the book be removed immediately. This time, the teacher reluctantly complied, but with a foreboding warning to never speak of the book again. The book was quickly removed from circulation, but the damage was irreversible. The disappearances continued, leaving behind an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. The affected students were left grappling with the psychological scars of their encounters with the book. The once thriving school community was now overshadowed by the darkness that had seeped into their lives. The student who had first raised the alarm was left profoundly affected. The eerie memories of the book's influence and the mysterious fates of her peers haunted her thoughts. The experience had forever altered her perception of the world, serving as a grim reminder of the dangers that can lurk behind seemingly innocuous surfaces. I had always admired my boyfriend for his passion and dedication as a history teacher. His charisma and engaging lessons earned him respect in our community. But beneath his scholarly charm, a horrifying secret was festering. It started with subtle changes. His late-night work sessions became more frequent, and he grew increasingly evasive. My worries grew until one night, I noticed his car parked in the driveway. Despite the late hour, driven by a sense of dread, I decided to investigate. The house, grand and imposing, seemed normal at first glance. However, as I ventured inside, an oppressive silence filled the air. I followed a faint, disturbing noise to the basement. The door, usually hidden, was slightly ajar. As I opened it, a chill ran down my spine. The basement was a nightmarish chamber. The walls were covered with grotesque drawings and symbols, and the floor was stained with dark, dried blood. Personal items from missing students were scattered around. Most unsettling was the soundproofing material that lined the walls and door, designed to muffle any cries for help. I saw him there with a terrified student. Her eyes met mine with sheer panic as she realized I had discovered the horrifying truth. His demeanor shifted from charming to menacing as he saw me. He lunged towards me, his face twisted in rage and desperation. In a frantic attempt to silence me, he tried to drag me into the basement's hidden depths. I struggled fiercely, my heart pounding with fear. My screams filled the basement, muffled by the soundproofing, but I fought to escape. I managed to break free momentarily, racing towards the stairs. He was determined to prevent me from escaping. As I reached the main floor, he grabbed me from behind, trying to pull me back down. My struggle was desperate and frantic. In the midst of the chaos, my screams were still largely contained, but I fought to get to the door. In a stroke of luck, as I struggled near the door, a neighbor, curious about the unusual activity and concerned by the sounds of commotion, noticed something was wrong. They heard my muffled cries and the noise coming from the house, prompting them to call the police and bang on the door. The teacher, realizing that his secret was about to be exposed, abandoned his attempt to subdue me. With a final, furious glare, he fled into the night. The police arrived soon after, and I was left trembling and disheveled, recounting the horror I had witnessed. When the police investigated, they were met with the grim reality. The basement, equipped with soundproofing, had concealed a horrifying scene. The walls were adorned with disturbing symbols, and the blood-stained floor was a chilling testament to his crimes. The evidence, including personal items from missing students, painted a clear picture of his depravity. The search for the teacher became a frantic manhunt, but he managed to evade capture, his whereabouts remaining unknown. The community was left in shock, grappling with the brutal truth that a trusted educator had hidden such monstrous acts behind a facade of respectability. The trauma of that night left deep, lasting scars. I had witnessed the darkest corners of human nature and survived, but the psychological impact was profound. The once safe haven of the teacher's home was forever tainted by the bloodshed and terror that had unfolded within its walls. When I was in high school, a new teacher joined our faculty, and his reputation quickly soared. He was known for his exceptional mentorship, and students, including myself, were eager to seek his guidance. His supportive nature and charismatic presence made him highly regarded by both students and parents. He offered private mentoring sessions to students struggling academically or personally. I was one of those students, hoping his expertise could turn my life around. Initially, the sessions seemed helpful, his advice was thoughtful, and his encouragement made me feel valued and understood. However, over time, the sessions took a disturbing turn. The teacher's guidance became increasingly intrusive. He began asking about my personal life in ways that felt unsettling, but I dismissed it as part of his mentoring approach. He suggested isolating myself from friends and family to focus on my self-improvement. His advice began to feel controlling rather than supportive. I noticed that my decisions, once independent, were now heavily influenced by his suggestions. The more I followed his advice, the more isolated I became. Friends who had once been close grew distant, and my relationships with family members deteriorated. The teacher's influence seemed to permeate every aspect of my life, and I found myself becoming a shadow of who I once was. As time went on, other students who had also attended his sessions began to display troubling changes. Some disappeared, while others acted out in disturbing ways. The atmosphere at school grew tense and fearful, but I was too entangled in his manipulative grasp to fully understand what was happening. When I tried to confront the teacher about the negative impact his guidance was having on my life, he dismissed my concerns with a dismissive air, making me doubt my own sanity. He convinced me that my issues were due to my own failures, and that his methods were designed to help me become stronger. The culmination of his influence left me feeling utterly alone and betrayed. The friends I had pushed away were now distant, and my family felt like a distant memory. The support I had once hoped for turned into a source of profound isolation. The teacher's presence, once a beacon of hope, had become a dark cloud over my life. The pain of realizing how deeply I had been manipulated was overwhelming. The sense of betrayal and the loss of meaningful relationships left me in a state of deep sorrow. I struggled to rebuild my life, but the scars of his influence remained. The emotional damage was profound, and the lingering effects of his control left me feeling lost and broken. In the end, the teacher's departure did nothing to ease the emotional turmoil I faced. The experience had left an indelible mark on my life, and the shadows of his manipulation continued to haunt me. The hope for a brighter future was overshadowed by the haunting reality of how easily trust and personal autonomy can be destroyed. I was home alone one evening, enjoying the quiet. As I settled in to watch a movie, I heard a strange noise coming from the basement. It sounded like something had fallen or been knocked over. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the house settling or maybe a draft moving something around. But the noise persisted, becoming louder and more frequent. My curiosity got the best of me, so I decided to investigate. Grabbing a flashlight, I cautiously made my way down the creaky stairs to the basement. The air grew colder with each step, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I shone the flashlight around the room. Boxes and old furniture were scattered everywhere, but nothing seemed out of place. I stood still, listening intently, trying to catch any sound. Suddenly, I heard the noise again, this time coming from the far corner of the basement. I slowly walked toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam of the flashlight revealed nothing unusual at first, but then I noticed a small, old cabinet door slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts telling me to turn back, but I had to know what was causing the noise. With a trembling hand, I opened the cabinet door wider and shone the flashlight inside. To my surprise, there was nothing but some old, dusty tools and a few cobwebs. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking I had just been imagining things. But as I turned to leave, I heard a whisper, so faint it was almost inaudible. I froze, my skin crawling with fear. The whisper repeated, clearer this time, and I realized it was coming from right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart raced, and I bolted up the stairs, not daring to look back. When I finally reached the safety of the living room, I locked the basement door and sat down, trying to calm my racing heart. I never figured out what caused those noises or where the whisper came from, but I knew one thing for certain: I would never go into that basement alone again. One night, I was alone at home, getting ready for bed. I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom when I glanced at the mirror. At first, everything seemed normal, but then I noticed something strange. There was someone else in the reflection, standing right behind me. I spun around quickly, but there was no one there. I looked back at the mirror, and the figure was gone. My heart was pounding, but I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light or my imagination playing tricks on me. I finished brushing my teeth and went to the bedroom, still feeling uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every time I passed by a mirror, I would catch a glimpse of a shadow or a movement, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. Later that night, I woke up suddenly. The room was dark, and the only light came from the moon outside the window. I felt a chill run down my spine, and turned to look at the mirror on the wall. There it was again, the same figure, standing behind me, staring directly at me through the mirror. I jumped out of bed and turned on all the lights, searching the room. There was no one there. I checked every corner, every closet, but I was alone. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just a dream, but I couldn't shake the fear. For the rest of the night, I stayed away from mirrors, not wanting to see that eerie figure again. The next morning, I covered all the mirrors in the house. I never wanted to experience that haunting reflection again. Even now, I still avoid looking into mirrors when I'm alone, afraid that I'll see that shadowy figure staring back at me. One evening, I was home alone reading a book in the living room. Everything was peaceful until the lights suddenly began to flicker. At first, I thought it was just a power surge, but the flickering continued, almost rhythmically. It felt like someone was deliberately playing with the lights. I got up to check the light switches, but they were all in their proper positions. I then went to the circuit breaker, thinking maybe something had tripped. Everything seemed fine there too. As I stood in the basement, the lights upstairs started to flicker more intensely. Feeling a bit unnerved, I went back upstairs. As soon as I reached the top step, the flickering stopped abruptly. I let out a sigh of relief, hoping that whatever caused it was over. I sat back down and tried to get back to my book, but I couldn't focus. The house felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. A few minutes later, the flickering started again, this time even more erratic. The lights would blink on and off in rapid succession, casting eerie shadows around the room. My heart began to race, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. It was as if the house was alive and trying to communicate with me through the lights. I decided to call an electrician, thinking there might be a serious issue with the wiring. As I reached for my phone, the lights went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. I froze, my fingers hovering over the phone screen, and that's when I heard a faint, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the corner of the room. I turned on my phone's flashlight and shone it toward the sound. There was nothing there, just empty space. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The whispering continued, growing slightly louder, but still too soft to understand. Panicking, I ran to the front door and flung it open, desperate to escape the oppressive darkness and the unsettling whispers. As soon as I stepped outside, the lights in the house came back on, steady and bright, as if nothing had ever happened. I stood on the porch, catching my breath, and trying to calm down. After a few minutes, I mustered the courage to go back inside. The house was quiet, and the lights were normal again. I checked every room, making sure there was nothing out of place. Everything seemed fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Since that night, I've always kept a flashlight close by, and made sure to leave a few lights on, even when I'm alone. The memory of those flickering lights and the mysterious whispers still haunts me, a reminder that sometimes, the darkness can hold more than just shadows. One quiet evening, I was relaxing at home alone, enjoying the calm. I had just finished watching a movie, and was about to head to bed, when I noticed something odd. The door to the kitchen, which I was certain I had closed earlier, was now wide open. A chill ran down my spine as I walked over to close it. I double-checked to make sure it was securely shut this time. Feeling uneasy, I decided to make a quick round of the house to ensure everything was in its place, and all doors were locked. Satisfied, I returned to the living room to turn off the lights and head upstairs. As I reached the top of the stairs, I glanced back down the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. The kitchen door was open again. This time, it was swinging gently, as if someone had just passed through. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe a draft, but all the windows were closed, and there was no wind. Summoning my courage, I went back down to the kitchen. The door creaked as I pushed it closed again, and I made sure to lock it this time. I lingered in the kitchen, listening for any signs of movement, but the house was silent. Too silent. I started back up the stairs, but halfway up, I heard the unmistakable sound of the door creaking open behind me. Fear gripped me as I slowly turned around. There it was, open again. My mind raced through possibilities, but none of them made sense. Who or what was opening the door? Grabbing a heavy flashlight from the hall closet, I cautiously approached the kitchen door once more. I peeked inside, my heart pounding. The kitchen was empty. I closed the door, locked it, and wedged a chair under the doorknob for good measure. Just as I was about to turn away, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible whisper from the darkness of the kitchen. I strained to listen, my breath caught in my throat. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, but I couldn't make out the words. It sounded like a conversation between two people, just out of reach. I backed away slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The whispering stopped abruptly, and the house fell into an eerie silence. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, too scared to go upstairs. I kept the flashlight close and the lights on, jumping at every little sound. The kitchen door stayed closed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. By morning, I was exhausted but relieved that nothing else had happened. I removed the chair and carefully opened the kitchen door. Everything was as it should be, but the memory of that door opening on its own and the strange whispering still haunts me. To this day, I always make sure to double-check that all doors are securely closed and locked, and I never go to bed without a flashlight nearby. One night, I was home alone, enjoying some peace and quiet. As I was about to settle down with a book, my phone rang. The number was unknown, but I answered it out of curiosity. "Hello?" I said. There was silence on the other end for a moment, and then a voice, low and raspy, whispered my name. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The caller didn't respond immediately. Instead, there was a faint sound, like breathing, before the line went dead. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just a prank. A few minutes later, my phone rang again. It was the same unknown number. I hesitated, but then answered it. This time, the voice was clearer, still whispering, but now saying things about me, details only someone close to me would know. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened. "How do you know that?" I demanded, my fear turning into anger. But again, there was no answer, just that eerie breathing, and then the call ended. I put my phone down, my hands shaking. I decided to call a friend to stay over, but before I could, the phone rang again. I didn't want to answer, but curiosity got the better of me. The voice was back, whispering more personal details, recounting things I had done earlier that day. Panic set in. I looked around the room, feeling as if I was being watched. I ran to the windows and doors, checking to make sure they were locked. The phone rang again. This time, I didn't answer. Instead, I texted my friend, asking them to come over immediately. While waiting for my friend, I kept glancing at my phone, half expecting it to ring again. I turned on all the lights in the house, hoping it would make me feel safer, but it didn't. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Finally, my friend arrived. I explained what had happened, and we tried calling the unknown number back, but it was always out of service. We stayed up all night, the phone silent, but my nerves on edge. As the clock struck midnight, my phone buzzed with a text message from the unknown number. It read, "I'm closer than you think." My blood ran cold. We searched the house again, every corner, every closet, but found nothing. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from the attic. My friend and I exchanged terrified looks. Armed with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, we cautiously made our way to the attic. The door creaked open, and the flashlight beam cut through the darkness. There was nothing but old boxes and dust. Just as we were about to leave, the phone rang again. The same number. With trembling hands, I answered it, putting it on speaker so my friend could hear. The voice, now clearer and more menacing, said, "I'm watching you." The call ended abruptly. We bolted out of the attic and locked ourselves in the living room, waiting for morning. Every sound, every creak of the house made us jump. Finally, as dawn broke, we felt a bit more secure. The calls never came again, but the memory of that night haunts me. The thought that someone was watching me, knowing so much about me, still sends chills down my spine. To this day, I'm wary of unknown numbers, and I always make sure my doors and windows are securely locked.